Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore one of the most extraordinary migrations in human history, the California Gold Rush of 1849, and discover what really happened when hundreds of thousands of people abandoned everything they knew to chase a dream of instant wealth in the western wilderness. We'll walk alongside those who made the journey, feel the weight of their hopes and disappointments, and slowly piece together how the promise of gold transformed not just California, but the entire shape of America. We'll meet the dreamers and the schemers, the lucky and the lost, and contemplate what this fever for fortune reveals about human nature, about risk and reward, about what we're willing to sacrifice in pursuit of something better. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a frantic tale of adventure or a sensational exploration of violence and greed. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the discovery, through the journey west, through the back-breaking work in the diggings, and through the quiet transformations that followed. We'll take our time with the landscape, the people, the hopes that drove them forward. By the end, I think you'll find that the gold rush was not just about finding gold, but about the eternal human hunger for transformation, for escape, for the chance to begin again. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's most profound moments, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth. And let's begin our slow drift through 1849, through the goldfields, through dreams of fortune and toward understanding. There's nowhere you need to be, no deadlines to meet. Just listen and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin in January of 1848, on a cold morning in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, when everything changed. The American River ran clear and cold that winter morning, rushing down from the mountains through a landscape of oak and pine. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible, and the sun was just beginning to touch the tops of the trees. James Wilson Marshall, a carpenter and sawmill operator, was walking along the tail race of the mill he'd been building for John Sutter, checking the depth of the channel that carried water away from the water wheel. He was 44 years old, a moody and solitary man who'd drifted west from New Jersey years before, searching for something he probably couldn't have named. The mill sat in a place called Coloma, about 50 miles northeast of Sutter's Fort, in a valley so remote that the nearest neighbour was miles away. Marshall had been working on this mill for months, and the previous night they'd opened the head gate to let water scour out the tail race, deepening the channel so the wheel would turn more efficiently. Now, in the clear morning light, he was inspecting the results of the night's work, and there, in about 6 inches of water, catching the early sunlight, were flakes of yellow metal resting against the bedrock. Marshall bent down, reaching into the cold water. The flakes were small, some no bigger than grains of wheat, others the size of a pea. They were heavy for their size, much heavier than the grey and brown stones around them. They had a particular lustre, a warm glow that held the light. Marshall, like most men of his time, had seen enough gold to recognise what it might be, but he'd also seen enough fool's gold, iron pyrite, to be cautious. He gathered several of the flakes and small nuggets, wrapping them carefully in a cloth. The morning routine of the mill continued around him. Men preparing to work, the sound of saws and hammers, breakfast fires being built. Marshall told no one yet. First, he needed to be certain. Over the next few days, Marshall conducted tests. He hammered the metal between rocks. It flattened rather than shattering, which meant it wasn't pyrite. He had someone check in a copy of the Encyclopedia Americana they had at the camp. He boiled one piece in lye used for soap making. Gold wouldn't tarnish. Every test confirmed what he increasingly believed but hardly dared to admit. This was gold. Real gold. And there seemed to be quite a lot of it. On January 28th, Marshall rode the 50 miles to Sutter's Fort in a driving rainstorm. He arrived at night, insisting on speaking privately with John Sutter. The two men locked themselves in a room, tested the samples again using nitric acid, weighed them against silver coins. By morning, both men knew for certain. James Marshall had discovered gold in the mill race at Coloma. Now, John Augustus Sutter was one of the most important men in California at that time, though California itself was hardly important to the wider world. He was Swiss by birth, a man who'd fled his homeland to escape debts and an unhappy marriage, and he'd created in the Sacramento Valley a kind of personal empire. Sutter's Fort was more than just a fort. It was a settlement, a trading post, a centre of agriculture and commerce. Sutter had nearly 12,000 acres of land granted to him by the Mexican government. Thousands of cattle and horses, orchards and wheat fields, a distillery, a tannery, workshops of every kind. He employed hundreds of Native Americans and had his own small army. Sutter should have been thrilled by the discovery of gold, but instead, he felt something closer to dread. He understood, perhaps more clearly than Marshall did, what this discovery would mean. Gold would bring people. Thousands of people, tens of thousands. They would overrun his land, ignore his property rights, slaughter his cattle for food, tear up his fields looking for gold. Everything he'd built over the past decade would be destroyed. The orderly empire he'd created would dissolve into chaos. Sutter tried to keep the discovery secret. He made Marshall and the mill workers promise not to tell anyone. He tried to buy the land where the gold had been found, writing to the military governor of California to secure his claim. He negotiated with the local Native Americans, trying to establish some kind of exclusive right to mine. None of it would work. You cannot keep a secret like gold. The workers at the mill, despite their promises, couldn't help themselves. Within weeks, men from Sutter's Fort were slipping away to try their luck at Coloma. They told friends, who told others. By March of 1848, people in the small settlement of San Francisco, about 150 miles away, were hearing rumours. But they were just rumours, and California had seen plenty of rumours before. Most people were sceptical. Then Sam Brannan got involved, and skepticism evaporated. Sam Brannan was an entrepreneur, a Mormon elder who'd led a group of settlers to California in 1846. He owned a store at Sutter's Fort and another in San Francisco. When he heard the rumours about gold, he went to see for himself. What he found at Coloma convinced him that this was real, and his mind immediately began calculating not how to find gold, but how to profit from those who would. In May of 1848, Sam Brannan walked through the streets of San Francisco carrying a bottle filled with gold dust, holding it high, shouting San Francisco at that time was a sleepy settlement of about 800 people. Within weeks it was nearly deserted. Men dropped their tools, left their shops, abandoned their ships in the harbour, and headed for the foothills. The California gold rush had begun, though it was still a local affair, still contained to California itself. But Brannan, before he'd made his announcement, had done something clever. He'd bought up every pickaxe, pan, shovel, and mining tool he could find in California. He'd stocked his stores with supplies, so when the rush began, he had a monopoly on the equipment people desperately needed. A metal pan that sold for 20 cents a few weeks earlier was now $5. A pickaxe was $15. Brannan, selling supplies to miners at his store at Sutter's Fort, was making more in a day than most men made in a month. He would later say, with some pride, that he made more money during the gold rush than almost anyone, and he never dug for gold himself. This pattern would repeat itself thousands of times in the coming years. For every man who found fortune in the goldfields, there were a dozen who found fortune selling to the miners. The real gold rush, the reliable gold rush, wasn't in the streams and hillsides. It was in the general stores, the hotels, the saloons, the shipping companies, the banks. But in those early months of 1848, most people didn't understand this yet. They only understood that there was gold, that it could be picked up from the ground, and that fortunes were being made. By summer of 1848, California's small population had abandoned nearly everything else to search for gold. Farmers left crops unharvested. Soldiers deserted. Ships that arrived in San Francisco found their crews vanishing into the interior. Newspapers shut down because the printers had left for the mines. In Monterey, the military governor reported that the courthouse, the fort, even the jail had been abandoned. Everyone had gone to the goldfields. The finds in those early months were extraordinary. Gold was lying in the stream beds, could be picked up by hand or panned out of the gravel in a few minutes. A man could make in a day what he'd normally earn in a month. Some were making $50 a day, $100 a day. There were stories, not all of them exaggerated, of nuggets the size of eggs, of pans yielding several ounces of gold in a single washing, of men becoming wealthy in a matter of weeks. But California, in 1848, was very far from the rest of the world. It took months for news to travel. A letter sent from San Francisco to New York might take 6 months to arrive. So while California was in the grip of gold fever, the rest of the world remained largely unaware. That would change slowly at first, then with gathering speed, until the whole world seemed to be rushing toward California. In September of 1848, a military courier carried official samples of California gold to Washington, traveling by ship to Panama, overland through the jungle, then by ship again to the East Coast. The samples reached President James K. Polk in early December. On December 5, 1848, Polk addressed Congress and confirmed what the rumors had been saying. Gold had been discovered in California in abundance. The President of the United States was telling the world, "This is real." The effect was electric. Newspapers across the country ran the story on their front pages. Gold in California, available for the taking. The timing was significant. The United States was just emerging from the Mexican-American War, which had ended in February of 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That treaty had ceded California and much of the Southwest to the United States. So California was American territory now, or would be soon. Americans could go there without leaving their own country. The gold was theirs for the taking. But it wasn't just Americans who heard the news. Ships carried newspapers around the world. By early 1849, people in Chile and Peru were reading about California gold. Chinese ports were hearing the news calling California Gumshan, Gold Mountain. In France, in Germany, in Britain, in Ireland, newspapers published accounts of the discovery. Each telling amplified the story, made the gold more plentiful, the finding easier, the fortunes larger. People across the world began to calculate. The journey to California was expensive and dangerous, yes. But if the stories were true, if you really could pick up gold from the ground, if you really could make in a month what you'd normally earn in a year, wasn't it worth the risk? And remember the context. 1848 had been a year of revolution and upheaval across Europe, a year of crop failures and economic hardship. For many people, particularly in Ireland, where the potato famine was still devastating the population, California represented not just opportunity but escape, a chance to leave behind hunger and hopelessness for something better. In China, the situation was even more desperate. The Qing dynasty was weakening. Bandits roamed the countryside, populations were starving. When news of California gold reached the southern provinces, it must have seemed like a miracle. A place where you could work hard and become wealthy, where the streets were said to be paved with gold, where any man could make his fortune. It was a dream, but it was a dream that tens of thousands of Chinese were willing to risk everything to pursue. By winter of 1848 and into 1849, the rush was becoming global. But between the dreamers and the goldfields lay thousands of miles of ocean, or thousands of miles of wilderness, or both. Getting to California would prove to be an ordeal that killed thousands before they ever saw their first flake of gold. But we'll come to that. For now, picture the moment in late 1848, early 1849, when the news was spreading, when people were making calculations, selling possessions, saying goodbye to families, preparing for a journey into the unknown. James Marshall, who'd started it all with his discovery in the mill race, would never profit from the gold rush. He tried to mine, but wasn't successful. He tried to claim rights to the discovery, but was ignored. He spent his later years bitter, feeling he'd been cheated of the fortune that should have been his. He died poor in 1885, largely forgotten. John Sutter, who'd feared what gold would bring, saw his fears realised completely. His land was overrun, his cattle slaughtered, his workers departed, his empire destroyed. He spent decades in legal battles trying to recover his property, but California courts filled with men who'd come for gold and who'd squatted on his land were unsympathetic. He died in 1880, in Pennsylvania, still pursuing his claims, having lost nearly everything to the very discovery that should have made him fabulously wealthy. Sam Brannan, the entrepreneur who'd announced the discovery, and who'd profited so handsomely from selling supplies, became California's first millionaire. He invested in real estate, in businesses, became a powerful figure in San Francisco, but he too would eventually lose his fortune, dying broke in 1889. The gold rush made fortunes, yes, but it also destroyed them with remarkable efficiency. The discovery at Sutter's Mill on that cold January morning in 1848 was like dropping a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward, slowly at first, then faster, until they touched every continent, every ocean, transforming California from an obscure backwater into the symbol of American possibility, American restlessness, American hunger for something more. The gold was real, the opportunity was real, but so was the suffering that would follow. The environmental destruction, the violence, the thousands of broken dreams. Let that image settle for a moment. James Marshall, bending down in the cold morning water, picking up those first flakes of gold, having no idea that this simple discovery would bring hundreds of thousands of people rushing halfway around the world, would build cities and destroy ecosystems, would create fortunes and break hearts, would transform California and America and the lives of everyone who touched it. Gold had been found, and the world would never be quite the same. News travelled slowly in 1848, but it travelled with gathering momentum, like a wave building strength as it crossed the ocean. Let's think about what that meant, about how information moved in a world without telegraphs spanning continents, without telephones, without any form of instant communication. A letter sent from California to New York travelled by ship, either all the way around South America, a journey of 18,000 miles that could take 5 or 6 months, or by ship to Panama, then overland through 40 miles of jungle, then by ship again up the coast, which might save a few weeks but added danger and difficulty. So when President Polk confirmed the gold discovery in early December of 1848, he was confirming something that had been true since January, something that Californians had known for nearly a year. This delay created a strange situation. By the time the rest of America learned definitively about the gold, thousands of Californians had already been mining for months. They'd already picked up the easiest gold, the surface nuggets and flakes that required no skill or equipment to collect. They were already beginning to understand that while gold was real and plentiful, it wasn't quite as easy as the first story suggested. But the rest of the world was just receiving those first stories, those tales of gold lying on the ground waiting to be gathered, of men making fortunes in weeks. The information was true when it was written, but already outdated by the time it arrived. Newspapers in the eastern United States began publishing accounts in December of 1848 and throughout the winter and spring of 1849. The New York Herald, the New York Tribune, papers in Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore all carried stories about California gold, and these stories were read aloud in taverns, discussed in shops, debated around dinner tables. The stories had a particular flavour, a breathlessness that reflected both the genuine excitement of the reporters and the competitive nature of the newspaper business. Papers wanted to sell copies, and gold rush stories sold copies. Consider a typical account from early 1849. The accounts of the abundance of gold in that territory are of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by authentic reports. Then would follow descriptions of nuggets weighing several ounces, of riverbeds gleaming with gold, of common labourers becoming wealthy beyond imagination in a matter of weeks. These accounts were not entirely false, such things had happened, but they were the exceptions, the extraordinary cases, presented as if they were ordinary and typical. People reading these accounts had to make calculations. The journey to California was expensive. Passage on a ship around Cape Horn might cost $200 to $400, the equivalent of a year's wages for a working man. The overland journey was cheaper in terms of cash outlay, perhaps $60 to $80 for a wagon and supplies, but it required months of travel through wilderness, with all the dangers that implied. You also had to consider what you were leaving behind: a job, a farm, a family. Could you afford to leave for a year or more? What if the stories were exaggerated? What if you got there and found nothing? But then you had to weigh the potential reward. If a man could really make $10 a day, $20, $50 in the gold fields, and the newspapers insisted this was common, then even a few months of success would justify the expense and risk. And for those who were struggling, who were in debt, who were working jobs they hated, who felt trapped by circumstance, the calculation was even more compelling. California offered not just money but transformation, a chance to reinvent yourself, to escape whatever you were running from. By spring of 1849, the rush was in full motion. In New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in every port city on the East Coast, ships were being hastily prepared for the voyage to California. Companies formed overnight, selling shares to groups of men who would travel together. Pool resources, split whatever gold they found. These quote three seemed to spread risk and increase chances of success. If 50 men worked together, surely they'd do better than 50 men working separately. Or so the reasoning went. The ships that headed for California in 1849 were often barely seaworthy. Captains and owners, eager to profit from the rush, pulled old vessels out of retirement, made minimal repairs, crammed them with passengers beyond safe capacity. A ship designed to carry 50 passengers might sail with 200. The conditions were cramped, uncomfortable, and often dangerous, but the passengers were so eager to reach California that they accepted these conditions. Every day delayed was a day someone else might be claiming the best ground, finding the richest deposits. Some ships offered different classes of passage. First-class passengers had private cabins, relatively decent food, some comfort. They might pay $400 or $500 for the privilege. Steerage passengers, the majority, shared large common spaces below deck, brought their own food or ate whatever the ship provided, which was usually salt pork and hardtack. They paid less, perhaps $150 to $200, but they suffered more. The voyage around Cape Horn typically took 5 to 8 months, sometimes longer if weather was bad or the ship was slow. 5 to 8 months in cramped, dark, damp quarters, eating monotonous food, with nothing to do but wait and imagine the goldfields waiting at the end. The ships that sailed in early 1849 carried about 700 vessels and 25,000 passengers around Cape Horn before the year ended. Most left from New York or Boston, though ships departed from nearly every Atlantic port. They sailed south along the coast of South America, through waters that grew colder as they approached Cape Horn at the continent's southern tip. Cape Horn was infamous among sailors, a place of violent storms, enormous waves, bitter cold, where ships could be battered for weeks trying to round the Cape and enter the Pacific. Some ships were lost, simply disappearing in the Southern Ocean with all hands aboard. Others were damaged and had to turn back. But most made it through, eventually, and turned north toward California, sailing up the coast of Chile and Peru, sometimes stopping for fresh water and supplies, then continuing to San Francisco. Life aboard these ships settled into a strange routine. Men, and they were almost all men, though a few women made the journey, formed friendships and rivalries. They gambled, they read, they talked endlessly about what they'd do when they reached California. Some kept journals documenting the voyage in careful detail. These journals, many of which survive, tell us about the daily reality of the journey. They describe storms that lasted days, that sent everything not secured crashing about the ship, that left passengers sick and terrified. They describe the tedium of calm days when the ship barely moved and time seemed to stop. They describe the food, salt beef so hard it had to be soaked before eating, weevil-infested biscuits, coffee that was more water than coffee. They describe the smells, the sounds, the constant creaking of the ship, the way privacy disappeared and men learned things about each other they might have preferred not to know. But threading through these journals is also hope, anticipation, planning. Men calculated how much gold they'd need to find to make the journey worthwhile. They discussed mining techniques, though most had never mined anything. They made pacts about staying together once they arrived, about helping each other, about sharing discoveries. Some wrote letters home that wouldn't be sent until they reached California, telling families they were well, asking forgiveness for leaving, promising to return wealthy. Some of these promises would be kept, most would not. Not everyone took the sea route around Cape Horn. Some chose what seemed like a shortcut, sail to Panama, cross the Isthmus overland, then take another ship from Panama's Pacific coast to California. On a map, this looks much shorter, and in terms of distance it was about 5,000 miles of ocean travel instead of 18,000. But the 40-mile crossing of the isthmus proved to be one of the most dangerous parts of any gold rush journey. Panama in 1849 was a place of steaming jungle, yellow fever, malaria, cholera, and virtually no infrastructure for the thousands of gold rushers who began arriving. The plan was to take a riverboat up the Chagres River as far as possible, then continue by mule or on foot to Panama City on the Pacific coast. In theory, this could be done in a few days. In practice, it often took weeks, and it killed many who attempted it. Imagine arriving at the mouth of the Chagres River after weeks at sea. The air is thick and hot, heavy with moisture. The jungle is dense, overwhelming. Louder than seems possible with the sounds of birds and insects. You negotiate with local boatmen for passage up the river. They charge outrageous prices because they can. There are hundreds of desperate men and only a few boats. You pay $10, $20, more for passage that might take 3 days or might take a week depending on water levels and weather. The riverboat is a dugout canoe, barely large enough for you and your baggage. You sit in inches of water that never quite drains, under a sun that seems to burn right through whatever hat you're wearing. The boatmen pole the canoe upstream, making slow progress. At night, you sleep on the riverbank if you can find a dry spot, or in the boat if you cannot. The mosquitoes are relentless. The heat is suffocating. Your food begins to spoil immediately in the humidity. You start to understand that this shortcut might have been a mistake. Eventually you reach the end of navigable river and continue on foot or by mule. The trail, calling it a trail is generous, winds through jungle, up and down muddy hillsides, across streams. The mules, like the boats before them, cost far more than they should. $20 to rent a mule for a day's journey, when that same $20 would buy a horse outright back home. But what choice do you have? You pay, and you continue. The diseases are what killed most people who died crossing Panama. Yellow fever and malaria were endemic, spread by mosquitoes that bred in the standing water of the jungle. Cholera spread among the travellers themselves, passed through contaminated water and poor sanitation. Men would be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall, the disease working with terrifying speed. There were no hospitals, no doctors, just mass graves along the trail. No one knows exactly how many died crossing Panama in 1849, but estimates suggest perhaps 10% or more of those who attempted it. Hundreds, certainly, possibly thousands. Those who survived the crossing reached Panama City, only to find another problem. There weren't enough ships on the Pacific side. Thousands of gold rushers were stranded, waiting weeks or months for passage north to California, living in makeshift camps, running out of money, getting sick. The ships that did arrive could charge whatever they wanted. Prices for passage from Panama to San Francisco rose from $100 to $300 to more. Men who'd spent everything getting to Panama found themselves trapped, unable to afford the final leg of the journey, too poor to go back, slowly dying of disease or despair in a city that had no use for them. Still others chose the overland route from the American Midwest and East. This was the cheapest option in terms of cash outlay. But it required months of hard travel through territory that was still largely unknown to American settlers. The route generally followed the Oregon Trail, well established by 1849, until it branched off toward California at various points. The journey began in towns along the Missouri River, Independence, St. Joseph, Council Bluffs. These jumping-off points became chaotic in the spring of 1849 as thousands of gold seekers gathered, buying wagons and oxen, organizing into traveling parties, preparing for the 2,000-mile journey west. The economics of the overland journey were different from the sea voyage. Instead of paying for passage, you bought equipment and supplies. A wagon cost about $60 to $80. A team of oxen cost perhaps $100 more. Then you needed supplies for months on the trail: flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, beans, rice. You needed tools, spare parts for the wagon, guns and ammunition for hunting and protection. All told, a man travelling overland might spend $100 to $200 outfitting himself, less than ship passage but still a substantial sum. And unlike the ship, where you were mostly passive waiting to arrive, the overland journey required constant work and decision-making. The wagons left in spring, usually April or May, timing their departure so they'd cross the mountains before winter snow blocked the passes. They travelled in groups for safety and mutual support, though these groups often fragmented over time as personalities clashed, or different parties moved at different speeds. The daily routine was monotonous. Wake before dawn, harness the oxen, drive all morning, rest during the heat of midday, drive until evening, make camp, cook dinner, sleep, and repeat. Day after day for 4 or 5 or 6 months. The landscape changed gradually as they moved west. The green farmland of Missouri gave way to prairie grassland stretching to the horizon. Then the terrain became more arid, the grass shorter, the soil sandy. The Platte River Valley provided a natural highway west, a long flat corridor where the wagons could make good time. But water was sometimes scarce, and the alkali dust was terrible, getting into everything, choking men and animals alike. As they continued west, the challenges increased. The crossing of the Rockies required steep climbs and descents that tested the wagons and exhausted the draft animals. The desert stretches beyond the mountains were even worse, long waterless expanses where grass was scarce and the heat was brutal. Some men abandoned heavy items along the trail to lighten the load: furniture, tools, even food, creating a trail of discarded possessions that marked the route. Disease travelled with the wagon trains just as it did on the ships and across Panama. Cholera was the worst, spreading through contaminated water sources shared by multiple parties. When someone contracted cholera, they died quickly, often within hours, and the living had to bury them in shallow graves along the trail and move on. Accidents killed people too. Men falling under wagon wheels, drowning in river crossings, shot accidentally while hunting or cleaning guns, crushed by falling trees kicked by animals. Children were particularly vulnerable, and the families that brought children on the overland journey faced agonizing decisions when those children sickened or died far from any town or doctor. The Native American tribes whose lands the wagon trains crossed had mixed reactions to this invasion. Some traded with the travellers, providing fresh horses or information about water sources in exchange for goods. Others attacked wagon trains, seeing the thousands of white Americans streaming across their territory as a threat to their way of life, which it was. The relationship was complex and varied by tribe, by location, by circumstance, but the overwhelming presence of the gold rushers, thousands in 1849, tens of thousands in the years that followed, fundamentally disrupted the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains and the Intermountain West. By late summer and fall of 1849, the wagon trains were reaching California, descending the Sierra Nevada into the Sacramento Valley. The survivors, and not all survived. Estimates suggest perhaps 5% of overland travellers died en route, arrived exhausted, their supplies depleted, their oxen worn to nothing, but they had made it. They had crossed the continent. California and the goldfields lay ahead. Ships sailing from other parts of the world were arriving too. From Chile and Peru came miners experienced with silver deposits, men who understood geology and mining in ways that most American gold rushers did not. From Hawaii came both native Hawaiians and American residents of the islands. From Australia came men who would later discover gold in their own country and create a rush there. And from China, from the Pearl River Delta region around Canton, came thousands of men who called California Gum Shan, Gold Mountain, and who saw it as their best hope for earning money to send home to families in desperate poverty. The Chinese gold rushers faced particular challenges. The Pacific crossing from China to San Francisco took 6 to 8 weeks in crowded ships. The passengers were mostly young men from rural villages, many of whom had never seen the ocean before. They travelled on credit, borrowing money to pay for passage with the expectation that they'd repay it from gold earnings. This debt system, run by Chinese merchants and associations, created obligations that would shape the Chinese experience in California. The debts had to be repaid, which meant Chinese miners often worked longer hours, lived more frugally, persisted in claims that others abandoned. They had no choice. They owed money, and their families back home depended on whatever they could send. By the end of 1849, perhaps 80,000 people had arrived in California seeking gold. San Francisco, which had been a settlement of about 800 people in early 1848, was now a city of 25,000. Ships crowded the harbour, so many that there weren't enough crews to sail them. The sailors had all deserted to try their luck in the goldfields. Some ships were converted into warehouses or hotels or saloons, just pulled up to the shore and repurposed because that was easier than trying to sail them anywhere. The city was a chaotic jumble of tents and wooden shacks, with a few more substantial buildings going up as quickly as lumber could be milled. Prices for everything were astronomical. A blanket cost $10, an egg cost $1, a simple meal might cost $5. Labour was almost impossible to hire because anyone who could work could make more in the goldfields, or thought they could. The roads leading from San Francisco into the interior were crowded with men heading to the mining districts. They walked, rode horses or mules, drove wagons piled with supplies. The foothills of the Sierra Nevada were filling with mining camps, each one a collection of tents and crude shelters clustered around wherever gold had been found. These camps had names that reflected both hope and humour: Hangtown, Rough and Ready, Poker Flat, Rich Bar, Poverty Hill. The names tell you something about the miners' state of mind. They could laugh at themselves and their situation, even while working themselves to exhaustion in pursuit of wealth. From across the world, from every direction, by every possible route, they came. The voyage had been long, expensive, dangerous. Many had died getting there. All had left behind homes, families, lives they knew. They'd been driven by hope, by desperation, by the dream of gold, by the possibility of transformation. They'd believed the stories, or half believed them, or chosen to believe them because the alternative was continuing a life that felt insufficient or unbearable. And now they were arriving in California, ready to begin the work of finding gold, having no real idea what that work would entail, how hard it would be, how unlikely success was for any individual miner. The journey had been an ordeal, but in some ways it had been the easier part. The journey had been about endurance, about surviving, about reaching California. The goldfields would be about something else entirely, about backbreaking labour, about luck, about learning that the dream of easy wealth was largely a myth, but also about discovering that California was indeed a place where fortunes could be made, just not usually by the miners themselves. Let that thought settle for a moment. 80,000 people arriving from every direction, speaking a dozen different languages, carrying dreams and fears and hopes, all converging on the streams and hillsides of the Sierra Nevada foothills. The world had heard there was gold in California, and the world had responded by sending its dreamers, its desperate, its ambitious, its foolish, its brave. What they would find there, what they would do to each other and to the land, what would become of them. Those are the questions we'll explore as we continue. But for now, just picture them arriving, seeing California for the first time, standing at the threshold of whatever their future would be, not yet knowing how it would unfold. The journey to California was not one journey, but three, each with its own particular hardships, its own way of testing those who attempted it. Let's walk through what these journeys actually felt like, what they cost in money and effort and life, because understanding the ordeal of getting there helps us understand what kind of people arrived in the goldfields, what they'd already survived, what they were willing to endure. The overland route across the continent was perhaps the most demanding in terms of daily effort and constant decision-making. Imagine you're a farmer from Ohio, or a shopkeeper from Pennsylvania, or a labourer from New York. You've sold what you owned, said goodbye to your family, and made your way to Independence, Missouri or St. Joseph, one of the jumping-off towns on the edge of settled America. It's April of 1849. The town is crowded with thousands of other gold seekers, all buying supplies, forming companies, preparing for departure. You've spent perhaps $150 on a wagon, oxen and supplies. This is nearly everything you have. The wagon is simple, sturdy, built to carry a ton or more of supplies over 2,000 miles of rough terrain. You've loaded it with 200 pounds of flour, 150 pounds of bacon, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 pounds of sugar, 50 pounds of beans. You have a rifle, ammunition, basic tools, spare wagon parts, a tent, blankets, cooking equipment. Everything you'll need for 4 or 5 months on the trail, or everything you think you'll need. Most people overpack initially, bringing items they'll later abandon to lighten the load. You've joined with a company of 30 or 40 other men, most of them strangers. You've elected a captain, established rules about guard duty and order of march, agreed to help each other. These agreements will be tested repeatedly over the coming months. For now, there's excitement, anticipation. The grass is greening up, the weather is warming, it's time to go. The first few weeks are almost pleasant. The trail is well marked, worn smooth by the thousands who've travelled this way before, first to Oregon, now to California. The prairie stretches endlessly, grass and wildflowers, the sky enormous above you. You wake before dawn, build a fire from buffalo chips, dried dung, the only fuel available on the treeless prairie, make coffee, cook breakfast. You harness the oxen, which is harder than it sounds because oxen are stubborn and slow, and each one weighs perhaps a ton. By 7 in the morning, you're moving. The wagon creaks and sways, pulled by the oxen plodding along at perhaps 2 miles per hour. You walk alongside, not riding in the wagon. Riding is uncomfortable, and the oxen need all their strength for pulling, not carrying extra weight. So you walk all day, 10 miles, 12 miles, 15 if conditions are good. Your feet develop blisters that break and bleed and develop calluses. Your legs ache. But you keep walking because everyone around you is walking, because this is what it takes, because California is still 2,000 miles away, and every mile you cover is one less you have to walk tomorrow. At midday, you stop to rest during the heat. The oxen graze, you eat a cold meal, perhaps you nap in the shade of the wagon. Then you continue until evening, when you form the wagons into a circle, not for defense against Indians, despite what stories later claimed, but simply as a corral for the animals and a way to organize the camp. You unhitch the oxen, let them graze, cook dinner over a fire of buffalo chips or cottonwood when you can find it. You eat salt pork and beans, hardtack and coffee. You talk with the other men, play cards perhaps, write in your journal if you're keeping one, check your wagon and equipment for problems. Then you sleep on the ground, under the wagon if it rains, under the stars if it's clear. And the next day you do it again, and the next, and the next. Day after day, week after week, the routine becomes automatic. The landscape changes so slowly you hardly notice. The grass gets shorter, the soil more sandy, the trees more scarce. You follow the Platte River west, this wide, shallow river that's quote for, as people say. The water is muddy, full of alkali that gives some people dysentery. You learn to let it settle in a bucket before drinking, or to dig a hole near the river and let water seep in from below, which filters out some of the sediment. The monotony is broken by river crossings, which are always anxious moments. Will the wagon bed stay sealed? Or will water seep in and ruin your flour and beans? Will an ox lose its footing in the current? Will someone slip and be swept away? You hire local Indians to help with the crossing when you can, paying them a few dollars to guide you to the best ford and help get the wagons across. Most crossings go well, but occasionally a wagon tips, supplies are lost, sometimes a person drowns. You bury them on the riverbank and continue. There's no time for extended mourning. The season is advancing, and you must reach the mountains before snow. By June, you're beyond the last outpost of settlement, beyond Fort Laramie, heading into country that feels genuinely wild. The grass is sparser now. You're rationing water for yourself and the animals. The sun is brutal, the air dry, the dust constant. It gets in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your food. Everything tastes of dust. You develop a cough that won't go away. The oxen are showing signs of fatigue, moving slower, their ribs beginning to show despite the grass they graze each evening. You start seeing graves along the trail. Some are marked with wooden crosses or carved stones. Others are just mounds of rocks piled over a shallow grave. Cholera, mostly. The disease spreads through the wagon trains with terrifying speed. A man is fine in the morning, complaining of stomach cramps by noon, dead by sunset. The symptoms are horrible. Violent vomiting and diarrhea, dehydration so severe that skin turns blue and shrivels, muscle cramps that contort the body. There's no treatment that works. You either survive or you don't, and most who get it don't. The fear of cholera is constant. You boil water when you can, but fuel is scarce and the effort is great. You avoid sick people, but in a wagon train of 30 or 40 men, avoidance is impossible. When someone in your company gets sick, you isolate them as best you can, give them water and wait. If they die, and they usually do, you dig a grave 6 feet deep, trying to get below where wolves and coyotes will dig, though you know that probably won't work. You wrap the body in a blanket, say a few words, cover the grave with rocks and move on. You don't spend an extra day mourning because every day matters, because winter is coming, because you can mourn later if you survive. The trail is littered with abandoned possessions. Heavy furniture that seemed essential back in Missouri is now dead weight, abandoned to lighten the load. You see feather beds, cast iron stoves, anvils, trunks of clothing, mining equipment, books. It's a trail of diminishing dreams, of people learning the hard way what's essential and what's not. Your own wagon is getting lighter too. You've thrown out the extra tools, the luxury items, some of the food you now realize you pack too much of. The oxen need every advantage. They're the difference between making it and not making it. By July, you're in the mountains, the real mountains, not the rolling hills but the Rockies, steep climbs and descents that test the wagon's construction and the oxen's strength. Going uphill, the oxen strain, their heads down, their breathing laboured. Sometimes you have to double team, using oxen from 2 wagons to pull one wagon up a particularly steep section, then going back for the second wagon. Going downhill is almost worse. You lock the wheels with chains to keep the wagon from rolling too fast, but it's still barely controlled descent. The wagon pushing the oxen, everyone praying that nothing breaks. You're above timberline in some places, the air thin, the nights cold even in midsummer. Snow remains in shaded couloirs. The views are spectacular, mountains stretching in every direction, but you're too tired and too worried to fully appreciate them. Your focus is narrow. Keep the wagon moving, keep the oxen healthy, don't make mistakes, survive. Beyond the mountains, you enter the desert. This is where the trail gets truly dangerous. Long stretches with no water, or water so alkaline it's poisonous. The heat is crushing. You travel at night when you can, resting during the day under whatever shade you can find or create. The oxen are suffering badly now. Some are dying, just collapsing and not getting up again. When an ox dies, you redistribute its yokemate to another team and continue. If too many die, you have to abandon the wagon, pack what you can on the remaining animals, and walk. The Humboldt River, which you follow for much of the Nevada desert, is a miserable watercourse, shrinking as it flows until it disappears entirely into a sink. The water is warm and bad tasting, the grass poor. But it's the only water, so you use it. Dead animals line the route. Oxen, mules, horses, all worked to death and left where they fell. The smell is terrible. Vultures circle constantly. You're running low on supplies now. The bacon is mostly gone, the flour is running out. You're down to beans and coffee and whatever game you can shoot, which isn't much in this barren country. You're losing weight, everyone is. Your clothes hang loose, your face is burned dark by the sun, lined with creases from squinting against the glare. You look 10 years older than you did when you left Missouri. And then, finally, in September or October, you reach the Sierra Nevada, the last barrier between you and California. The passes are high, over 7,000 feet, and you've heard stories about the Donner Party, trapped by early snow just 3 years ago, reduced to cannibalism to survive. You don't talk about it, but everyone knows the story. Everyone feels the urgency to cross before the snows come. The final climb is brutal. The trail is steep, rocky, barely wide enough for a wagon. You help other parties and they help you, everyone working together, because this is the culmination of months of travel, and no one wants to fail here, so close to the end. When you finally crest the summit and begin the descent into California, the relief is overwhelming. You've made it. You've crossed the continent. You've survived. The sea route around Cape Horn was a different ordeal, characterized more by tedium and discomfort than by daily physical exertion. Imagine boarding a ship in New York or Boston in January or February of 1849. You've paid $200 for steerage passage, or perhaps $400 for a cabin if you could afford it. The ship is crowded, loaded well beyond its intended capacity. What should carry 50 passengers is carrying 150 or 200. The captain and owners want to maximize profit, and passengers are desperate enough to accept the crowding. The first few weeks aren't too bad. You're sailing down the Atlantic coast. The weather is cold but manageable, and there's still excitement about the journey ahead. But as the ship continues south, approaching the equator, the heat becomes oppressive. Below deck, where most passengers spend their time, the air is stifling, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, bilge water, cooking, and seasickness. There's no privacy. You sleep in a bunk stacked 3 or 4 high, so close to the person above you that you can hear every breath, every movement, The food is monotonous and poor. Hardtack, hard biscuits made of flour and water, becomes infested with weevils within weeks. You learn to tap the biscuit on the table to shake out the bugs before eating, or you eat them anyway because protein is protein and you're hungry. Salt pork is the main protein, preserved in barrels of brine. It's incredibly salty, tough, and after a few weeks at sea it starts to go bad despite the salt. Coffee is weak, more like coffee-flavoured water than actual coffee. Fresh food runs out quickly. Within a month there's no fresh fruit, no vegetables, nothing but the preserved stores that will last the voyage. Scurvy begins to appear after 2 or 3 months at sea. Your gums swell and bleed. Old wounds reopen. You bruise easily. Your energy disappears. The ship's captain might have some knowledge of scurvy prevention. Lemon or lime juice helps, though no one yet understands why. But many captains are ignorant or indifferent. Men sicken, some die. The bodies are wrapped in canvas, weighted with rocks, and slipped over the side with a brief prayer. This happens often enough that it stops being shocking. Death is just part of the voyage. The weather provides the most dramatic moments, particularly when you round Cape Horn. This is the southern tip of South America, where the Atlantic and Pacific meet, where storms circle the globe unimpeded by land, building enormous waves and howling winds. The ship enters these waters in June or July, winter in the southern hemisphere, when conditions are worst. The storm, when it comes, is like nothing you've experienced. The waves are mountains of water, 30 or 40 feet high, that lift the ship up and drop it into troughs so deep that the world becomes just walls of water and screaming wind. The ship pitches and rolls, creaking and groaning, water crashing over the deck. Everything below deck that isn't secured goes flying. Men are thrown from their bunks, smashing into bulkheads, into each other. The sounds are terrifying. The wind shrieking through the rigging, the waves hammering the hull, the timbers groaning under stress, men shouting and praying and crying. The storm might last a few days or a few weeks. Some ships are driven back, unable to make progress against the wind, forced to sail hundreds of miles east before trying again to round the Cape. The passengers can do nothing but endure, strapped into bunks if possible, holding on to whatever's available, sick with fear and seasickness, praying for it to end. Some ships don't make it. They're driven onto rocks, or they break apart in the waves, or they simply disappear, lost with all hands. When the ship finally rounds the Cape and enters the Pacific, there's a sense of accomplishment, but also the realization that you're only halfway there. 3 or 4 more months of sailing north, up the coast of Chile and Peru and Central America before reaching California. The Pacific is gentler than the waters around Cape Horn, but the voyage is still long, still monotonous, still uncomfortable. You stop at ports along the way, Valparaiso, Callao, perhaps Panama, to take on fresh water and supplies. These stops are welcome breaks from the tedium of the ship, but they're also where diseases can spread. Yellow fever, typhoid, dysentery. These can be picked up in port and then spread through the crowded ship as it continues north. More men sicken, more die, more bodies go over the side. By the time you approach San Francisco Bay, usually in August or September, you've been at sea for 6 or 7 or 8 months. You're weak from poor diet, exhausted from the constant discomfort, desperate to be on solid ground again. The sight of land, the entrance to the bay, feels like salvation. The ship anchors in the harbour, and you gather your few possessions. Most of what you brought has been lost or ruined or discarded during the voyage, and prepare to go ashore. Many sailors deserted at this point, jumping ship to try their luck in the goldfields, which is why San Francisco harbour filled with abandoned ships. The ship you arrived on might never sail again, might be converted to some other use, might rot at anchor, but you don't care. You're in California. The journey is over. The Panama route, the supposed shortcut, proved to be perhaps the most deadly of the 3 routes, particularly in 1849 when infrastructure was minimal and diseases were epidemic. You arrive in Chagres, on the Caribbean coast of Panama, after a relatively comfortable ocean voyage from New York or New Orleans. The voyage took 2 weeks, maybe 3, and you're feeling good, confident that you've made the smart choice by avoiding both the overland hardships and the months-long voyage around Cape Horn. Chagres is a miserable place, a collection of thatched huts at the mouth of a muddy river swarming with mosquitoes, intensely hot and humid. But it's just the beginning, the place where you hire a boat to take you up the Chagres River. The boats are dugout canoes, operated by local Panamanians who speak little or no English and who charge outrageous prices because they can. You pay $20, $30, whatever they demand, because what choice do you have? You load your baggage into the canoe, less than you brought because there's limited space, and begin the journey upriver. The river is brown and slow, winding through thick jungle. The heat is suffocating, the humidity near 100%. Sweat pours off you constantly, soaking your clothes, which never dry in this climate. The boatmen pole the canoe upstream, making slow progress. You sit in the bottom of the canoe, inches of water sloshing around your feet, trying to stay in whatever shade the vegetation provides. The sun, when it hits you directly, is punishing. At night you camp on the riverbank if you can find a spot that's not too swampy. The mosquitoes descend in clouds, biting every exposed inch of skin. You try to build a smoky fire to keep them away, but it doesn't help much. Sleep is nearly impossible. The jungle is loud at night, filled with sounds you can't identify, movements in the darkness that might be animals or might be your imagination. You lie awake, sweating, itching from mosquito bites, wondering if this was a terrible mistake. After 3 or 4 days on the river, you reach Las Cruces or Gorgona, the end of the navigable water. Now you continue on foot or by mule. The mules, like the boats, are expensive. $10, $20 for a day's ride, and in short supply. If you can't get a mule, you walk, carrying your baggage, through mud that's sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep. The trail, such as it is, climbs into hills, crosses streams, winds through jungle so thick that you can barely see the sky. This is where many people die. The yellow fever and malaria that had always been present in Panama became epidemic in 1849, with the sudden influx of thousands of gold seekers. The mosquitoes that carry these diseases found abundant hosts. Yellow fever starts with headache and fever, then jaundice that turns your skin and eyes yellow, then bleeding from the mouth and nose. Some people recover, many don't. Malaria produces cycling fevers and chills, weakness, sometimes death. Cholera spreads among the travellers, transmitted through contaminated water. There's no infrastructure to handle this. No hospitals, no doctors beyond a few local practitioners who are overwhelmed. When you get sick, you're on your own, or dependent on the kindness of fellow travellers who are often too worried about their own survival to help much. Some people recover and continue. Some die and are buried in shallow graves along the trail. Some give up and try to return to Chagres, hoping to catch a ship back to the United States, admitting defeat before ever reaching California. If you survive the crossing, and remember, roughly 1 in 10 don't, you reach Panama City on the Pacific coast after a week or 2 of misery. And here you encounter another problem. There are no ships. Or rather, there aren't enough ships for the thousands of people who've crossed the isthmus and are now waiting for passage to California. Ships that once made regular runs between Panama and California, expecting perhaps a few dozen passengers per voyage, are now swamped with demand. You wait in Panama City, which is overwhelmed with gold seekers, short on food and clean water, rife with disease. You pay exorbitant prices for terrible accommodations. A hammock in a crowded room might cost $2 a night, when 50 cents would have been expensive. Food costs are equally inflated. You eat rice and beans and tropical fruit, trying to avoid the street food that might make you sick, trying to conserve your money because you don't know how long you'll be here. Some people wait weeks, some wait months. The ships, when they arrive, can charge whatever they want. Passage that might have cost $100 now costs $200, $300. You've already spent most of your money getting to Panama, and now you need to find more just to continue. Some people sell their possessions, their tools, their clothing, everything but what's absolutely essential. Some borrow money from the merchants in Panama City, accepting usurious terms because they're desperate. Some simply run out of money and stay in Panama, trapped, unable to go forward or back. When you finally do get on a ship, and assuming you do, assuming you haven't died of disease or given up, the voyage north to San Francisco takes 2 or 3 weeks. You're packed into the ship with hundreds of other passengers, everyone exhausted and sick and impatient. The ship stops at Acapulco or other Mexican ports to take on water and supplies. More chances for disease, more waiting. When you finally see San Francisco Bay, when you finally step onto California soil, you've been travelling for 2 months, maybe 3, since leaving New York or New Orleans. The shortcut has been anything but short, has cost more than you planned, has nearly killed you multiple times. But you're here. You've survived. Now comes the actual work of finding gold. These 3 routes, overland, around Cape Horn, across Panama, delivered roughly 80,000 people to California in 1849 alone. Each person had survived their own ordeal, had paid in money and suffering for the chance to look for gold. They arrived exhausted, often sick, sometimes penniless, but they arrived with hope intact or at least not completely extinguished. California, they believed, would make it all worthwhile. The goldfields waited. Fortune, they hoped, was just ahead. Let that settle for a moment. Think about what it means to travel for months, to risk your life repeatedly, to watch friends die, to suffer in ways you couldn't have imagined when you started, all for the possibility, not the certainty, just the possibility of finding gold. This wasn't rational in any conventional sense, but it made sense to the people who did it. Made enough sense that they abandoned homes and families, spent everything they had, endured unimaginable hardship. The journey itself was a filter, sorting out those who couldn't or wouldn't endure, leaving those who arrived in California as a self-selected group of the stubborn, the desperate, the driven, the lucky. These were the people who would build the goldfields, who would transform California, who would create fortunes and tragedies in roughly equal measure. After months of travel, after surviving oceans or deserts or jungles, the gold seekers finally arrived at the diggings, at the actual places where gold was being found, and what they encountered there was almost never what they had imagined. Let's walk slowly through what it was actually like to arrive at a mining camp, to begin the work of looking for gold, to discover the reality behind the dreams that had sustained you through the long journey. Picture yourself arriving at a place called Rich Bar, or Georgia Slide, or Mormon Island, one of the hundreds of camps scattered through the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. It's late summer or early fall of 1849. You've just completed the overland journey, or you've sailed from San Francisco up the Sacramento River as far as boats can go, then walked or ridden the final miles into the mountains. You're carrying whatever supplies you could afford or carry: a pick, a shovel, a pan for washing gravel, some food, a blanket, maybe a tent. The mining camp is not what you expected. There are no buildings, not really. Just tents scattered along a creek or river, crude brush shelters, a few canvas structures that might generously be called stores. Men are everywhere, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands depending on the camp's size. They're working in the stream, bent over pans or crude wooden contraptions called rockers or cradles, moving gravel and water in repetitive motions that look simple but are clearly exhausting. The sound is constant. The scrape of shovels on rock, the splash of water, the rattle of stones in pans, men calling to each other, arguing, occasionally laughing. The first thing you need to do is stake a claim. In most camps, this is done informally. You find a section of stream that isn't already claimed, perhaps 10 feet or 20 feet of creek bank, and you mark it somehow. Pile rocks, stick stakes in the ground, hang something visible. Then you register it with the camp's unofficial recorder, if there is one, or you simply tell the men working nearby that this is your claim now. The system is remarkably democratic and anarchic at the same time. There's no government authority, no land office, no official titles, just the agreement among miners that whoever gets there first and works the claim owns it, at least for now. Your claim might be good or might be worthless. The only way to know is to work it. So you begin. If you're working a stream placer, the most common method in 1849, you start by digging gravel from the stream bed or bank. You shovel it into your pan, a shallow metal dish perhaps 16 inches across. You add water from the stream, then you begin the washing motion that separates gold from gravel. The technique looks simple but takes practice to do well. You swirl the pan, letting water and gravel slosh over the edge, using the motion to carry away lighter materials while the heavier gold, if there's any gold, settles to the bottom. Swirl, slosh, swirl, slosh. You tilt the pan at just the right angle, use just the right amount of water, move with a rhythm that becomes almost meditative after a while. The lighter stones and sand wash away gradually. You add more water, continue swirling. After 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you've washed away most of the gravel, and what's left in the bottom of the pan is the heaviest material. Black sand, mostly magnetite, and hopefully some flakes of gold. Gold, when you first see it in your pan, is unmistakable. It catches the light differently than anything else, has a warm yellow colour that no other metal can quite match. The flakes are small, usually, perhaps the size of a pinhead or a grain of rice. Occasionally you might find a larger piece. A small nugget the size of a pea or a bean. Very rarely someone finds something truly large, an ounce, several ounces, and word of such finds spreads through the camp immediately, sparking hope in everyone who hears. You carefully separate the gold from the black sand, picking out the flakes with your fingers or using a drop of water to float them into a small bottle or leather pouch. Then you start again. Dig more gravel, pan it out, recover whatever gold is there, repeat. Hour after hour. Day after day. The work is backbreaking in ways that are hard to convey. You're bent over all day, either digging or squatting by the stream with the pan. Your back develops a constant ache that never quite goes away. Your hands blister from the shovel, then callous over, then crack and bleed from the constant wet and dry. The stream water is cold, often snowmelt from the high Sierras, and standing in it for hours makes your feet and legs go numb. In summer, the sun is brutal, reflecting off the water, burning your face and neck despite whatever hat you're wearing. In winter, the work is even worse. The water is near freezing, rain or snow is common, and finding enough dry wood to build a fire at night becomes a constant struggle. And the yield, the actual amount of gold you find, varies wildly. Some claims are rich. A man working a good claim in the early days might pan out half an ounce a day, occasionally more. An ounce of gold was worth about $16 in 1849, so an ounce a day meant you were making very good money by the standards of the time. A labourer back east might earn $1 a day. Even $5 a day was excellent wages. So $16, or $20, or $30, this was wealth, or at least the kind of daily income that could accumulate into wealth if you could maintain it. But most claims weren't that good. Most miners, most days, found far less. Perhaps a quarter ounce, perhaps a few pennyweights. There are 20 pennyweights in a troy ounce, so a few pennyweights might be $2 or $3 worth of gold. Some days you'd find almost nothing, just a few tiny flakes that weighed barely anything. And some claims, after days or weeks of hard work, proved to be nearly barren. You'd move to a new spot, stake a new claim, hope the next one would be better. The uncertainty was maddening. The man working a claim 50 feet upstream from you might be pulling out an ounce a day while you're barely finding enough to cover your expenses. Was it just luck? Was his technique better? Was there some geological reason his claim was richer? No one really knew. Mining in 1849 was more art than science, more gambling than calculation. You made guesses based on how the creek looked, where gravel had accumulated. Where bedrock was exposed, sometimes you guessed right, usually you didn't. The costs of living in the diggings were staggering, which meant even moderate gold finds didn't translate into actual wealth. Remember Sam Brannan and his monopoly on supplies in the early days? By 1849, there were more merchants, more competition, but prices were still astronomical by any normal standard. Flour cost $1 per pound, sometimes more. Back in the States, flour was perhaps 5 cents per pound, coffee was $2 per pound, sugar was similar, a pound of salt pork might cost $3, a pair of boots cost $40, a shirt cost $20. Everything was expensive because everything had to be transported into the mining districts over terrible roads or no roads at all. Ships brought supplies to San Francisco, then the supplies had to be moved inland by wagon or pack train, over rough trails, by men who charged premium prices for their services. Scarcity drove prices up, demand drove them higher, and miners, flush with gold dust when their claims were producing, paid these prices without much complaint because what else could they do? You needed food, you needed tools, you needed clothing. You paid what they asked. So a man who found half an ounce of gold in a day, $8 worth, might spend $5 or $6 on food and supplies, leaving only $2 or $3 as actual profit. The stories of men making fortunes in the goldfields were real, but they were the exceptions. The lucky few who found extraordinarily rich claims and worked them successfully before the gold ran out. For every one of those, there were dozens of miners who worked just as hard, endured the same privations, and ended each month barely ahead of where they'd started, or behind. Some miners used methods more sophisticated than simple panning. The rocker, or cradle, was one step up in technology and efficiency. It was a wooden box on rockers, like a baby's cradle, with a perforated metal sheet at one end and riffles, small wooden slats, along the bottom. You shoveled gravel into the box, poured water over it, and rocked the whole apparatus back and forth. The water and motion washed the lighter material out through the perforations, while the heavier gold settled behind the riffles. A rocker could process more gravel than panning, though it required at least 2 men to operate efficiently, one to shovel and one to rock and pour water. The long tom was even more efficient, essentially a longer sluice box through which water flowed constantly. You shoveled gravel into the upper end, the water carried it through, and the gold settled in riffles along the bottom. A long tom required a good water source, and usually required 3 or 4 men working together. But it could process far more gravel than a rocker or pan. Groups of miners sometimes partnered to build and operate long toms, dividing the gold they recovered according to whatever agreement they'd made. These partnerships were common in the diggings. You might join with 3 or 4 other men, pooling resources and labour. This had advantages. You could build better equipment, work more efficiently, share the costs of food and supplies, but it also created tensions. How do you divide the gold fairly? If one man works harder than the others, should he get a larger share? What if someone wants to leave the partnership, or new men want to join? These questions led to constant arguments, sometimes to dissolution of partnerships, occasionally to violence. The social world of the mining camps was strange and new, unlike anything that existed back in the settled states. These were communities of men, almost exclusively men. Women were rare in the diggings in 1849. A few came with their husbands, a very few came independently, but they were such a small minority that their presence was notable. One observer wrote that seeing a woman in a mining camp would bring work to a halt as men stopped to stare, not lewdly but simply in wonder at seeing a woman in this overwhelmingly male space. Without women, without families, without the normal social structures of settled communities, the camps developed their own rough culture. Men cooked their own meals, washed their own clothes, or more often didn't wash them, just wore things until they fell apart. Hygiene was poor. Men bathed rarely, wore the same clothes for weeks or months, lived in tents or crude shelters that offered minimal comfort. The camp smelled of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and in summer, the sharp mineral smell of disturbed earth and exposed rock. Food was monotonous and often poorly prepared. Men who'd never cooked in their lives tried to make meals over open fires, using limited ingredients and minimal equipment. They burned beans, made bread that was more like hardtack, cooked salt pork until it was leather. Fresh vegetables were rare, fresh fruit almost non-existent. Scurvy appeared in some camps, particularly in winter when supply lines were disrupted. Men's teeth loosened, their gums bled, old wounds reopened. Some died from it, though most recovered when they could finally get fresh food. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, the miners developed a rough camaraderie. Everyone was in the same situation. Everyone was working hard and hoping for luck. There was a democratic quality to the camps that was unusual for the time. The man working next to you might be a former lawyer, or a former farmer, or a former slave. In the goldfields, at least initially, these distinctions mattered less than back in the States. What mattered was whether you pulled your weight, whether you could be trusted, whether you were willing to help a neighbour when help was needed. The camps developed informal systems of justice and governance. When disputes arose, and they arose constantly, usually over claim boundaries or accusations of theft, the miners would hold a meeting, elect a temporary judge or jury, hear both sides, and render a verdict. The punishments were swift and practical. For theft, you might be whipped or expelled from the camp, or in rare cases hanged. For lesser offences, you might be fined or forced to make restitution. There was no appeal, no lawyers, no formal procedure. Just rough frontier justice, which was sometimes fair and sometimes arbitrary, but was generally preferable to no justice at all. The rhythm of life in the camps was simple but demanding. You woke at dawn or before, made a fire, cooked breakfast, coffee and fried pork and bread if you had it. Then you worked your claim all day, stopping only briefly at midday to eat a cold meal. You worked until the light failed, then returned to camp, cooked dinner, perhaps sat by the fire and talking with other miners, then slept in your tent or under the stars. The next day you did the same, and the next. Sunday was theoretically a day of rest, and some camps enforced this as a social norm, but many miners worked Sundays too, unable to resist the pull of the claim. The hope that today might be the day they found something significant. Mail call was one of the great events in the mining camps. Letters from home arrived irregularly, sometimes in bunches when the mail carrier made it through, sometimes with gaps of months when weather or other difficulties interrupted service. When mail arrived, work stopped. Men gathered around as the postmaster, usually just whoever had taken on the role, called out names. The cost of receiving a letter was high. Sometimes 50 cents or $1 charged to the recipient. Men paid without complaint, desperate for news from home, for connection to the world they'd left behind. Reading a letter from home was both joy and pain. You learned that family members were well, or that they were sick. You learned about births and deaths, about weather and crops, about the ordinary events of life that seemed both impossibly distant and achingly real. You felt homesick, guilty for being away, anxious about what you were missing. But you also felt the pressure to succeed, to make the separation worthwhile, to return with enough gold to justify the time away and the worry you'd caused. Writing letters home required care and judgment. You wanted to be honest, but you also didn't want to worry your family unnecessarily. So you might describe your claim as promising when it was barely producing. You might say you were in good health when you were actually suffering from dysentery or a persistent cough. You might say you'd quote 8 when you had no idea when that would be possible. These small deceptions accumulated, creating a gap between the reality of mining camp life and what families back home imagined. The gold itself, when you found it, was beautiful. You kept it in a small leather pouch or a glass bottle, adding to it as you worked your claim. The weight of the pouch grew slowly, ounce by ounce, a tangible measure of your labour. In the evenings you might pour it out into your palm, feeling the weight, seeing the light catch the flakes and small nuggets. Some men became almost obsessed with their gold, weighing it constantly, calculating and recalculating its value, imagining what they'd do with it when they finally had enough to go home. But gold in a pouch wasn't money, not quite. To convert it to actual currency, you needed to sell it. In most camps, merchants would buy gold dust at a discount to its official value, perhaps $14 per ounce instead of $16, the merchant's profit coming from that $2 spread. Or you could take it to San Francisco or Sacramento, where banks and assayers would pay closer to full value. But that required making the trip, taking time away from mining, and trusting that your claim wouldn't be jumped while you were gone. Gold dust also functioned as currency in the camps themselves. Merchants had scales and would accept gold dust as payment for goods. But the system was open to abuse. Some merchants had scales that weren't quite accurate, weighing out a bit less gold than they claimed. Some used a pinch method, reaching into the customer's poke or gold pouch and taking a pinch of dust as payment, and you can imagine how the size of a pinch might vary. Miners learned to watch merchants carefully, to bring their own scales when possible, to protect their gold as they'd protect money. As fall turned to winter in 1849, the character of mining began to change. The easy gold, the surface deposits that could be gathered with minimal effort, was disappearing from most claims. What had taken an hour of work in June might take a day of work in November to produce the same amount of gold. Miners began to understand that placer mining, recovering gold from stream gravels, was just the beginning. The real deposits, the mother lode from which all this placer gold had eroded, lay somewhere in the mountains, locked in veins of quartz that would require different techniques, different equipment, different amounts of capital to extract. Some miners began to leave, heading back to San Francisco or attempting the return journey home. They'd had enough. The work was too hard, the yields too uncertain, the living conditions too miserable. They'd given it a try, found a little gold or found none, and decided to quit while they still had their health and enough money to get home. Others stayed, convinced that their claim would improve, that they just needed to work a little harder or a little longer, that fortune was just ahead. This optimism, or stubbornness, or desperation kept them in the diggings through the winter, through the rains that turned camps into mud, through the cold that made the already hard work even harder, and some miners, a relative few, actually were doing well. They'd found good claims, or they'd developed the skills to work marginal claims efficiently, or they'd simply been lucky. These successful miners kept hope alive for everyone else. The stories of their finds spread through the camps, were embellished in the retelling, became the basis for renewed optimism. If he could find an ounce a day, why couldn't I? The next claim might be the one. Tomorrow might be different. Let that image settle. A mining camp in late 1849, hundreds of men scattered along a creek, each one bent over his claim, moving gravel and water in the ancient hope of finding something precious. The work is hard, the rewards uncertain, the living conditions barely tolerable. But the work continues because hope remains, because the alternative is admitting failure and going home empty-handed, because the dream of gold, the dream that brought them here across oceans and deserts, still flickers, still drives them forward, still seems possible if they can just work hard enough, if they can just be lucky enough, if they can just persist a little longer. The reality of the goldfields was harsher than the dream, always. But the dream was strong enough to keep men working despite the reality, strong enough to sustain them through another day of backbreaking labour, strong enough to whisper that tomorrow might be different, might be better, might be the day when fortune finally turns in their favour. While thousands of miners laboured in the streams and hillsides bent over their pans and rockers, a quieter but far more reliable fortune was being made by those who never picked up a shovel, never washed a pan of gravel, never spent a day working a claim. These were the merchants, the suppliers, the service providers who understood a fundamental truth about the gold rush. The real money wasn't in finding gold, but in selling to those who were trying to find it. Let's explore how this parallel economy worked, how it created fortunes that lasted long after the place of gold was exhausted, and what it revealed about the nature of opportunity and entrepreneurship. We've already met Sam Brannan, who made a fortune selling supplies before the rush truly began. But Brannan was just the first of many who recognized that miners needed things: food, tools, clothing, entertainment, services of every kind, and were willing to pay extraordinary prices for them. The markup on goods in the mining districts was often 200%, 300%, sometimes 500% above what those same goods cost in San Francisco or back east. A blanket that cost $2 in New York sold for $10 or $15 in the diggings. Flour that cost 5 cents a pound in the Midwest sold for $1 a pound, sometimes $2, in the mining camps. And miners paid these prices because they had no choice. They needed these things to survive, to work, to live. Consider the business model from a merchant's perspective. You buy supplies in San Francisco: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, tools, clothing. You spend, let's say, $1,000 on inventory. You transport these goods to the mining districts, either by pack train or wagon, paying perhaps $200 in freight costs. Now you have $1,200 invested. You set up a tent store in a mining camp and sell your inventory at triple the San Francisco price. That same inventory that cost you $1,000 wholesale now brings in $3,000. Subtract your freight costs. Subtract the cost of getting yourself to the mines and back, and you're left with perhaps $1,500 profit on a $1,200 investment. That's a return of 125%, earned in perhaps 2 or 3 months. Do this twice a year and you're making $3,000 annually, at a time when a very good salary was perhaps $1,200 a year. The profit margins were extraordinary, but so were the risks and hardships. Transporting goods into the mining districts in 1849 and 1850 was an ordeal. The roads, when they existed at all, were terrible. Rutted tracks that became impassable mud in winter, choking dust in summer. Pack trains of mules carried goods on trails too narrow or steep for wagons. The mules sometimes fell, sending loads tumbling down mountainsides. River crossings were dangerous, particularly during spring runoff when streams became torrents. Goods were lost, stolen, damaged by weather. A merchant might invest heavily in inventory only to have half of it ruined before reaching the mines. Storage was another challenge. In the camps, you didn't have a proper building, just a tent or a rough wooden structure that offered minimal protection from weather or theft. Flour got damp and spoiled. Cloth goods mildewed. Tools rusted. Theft was common enough that merchants often slept with their most valuable inventory or hired guards to watch their stock. These costs and risks justified, in the merchants' minds at least, the high prices they charged. Some merchants became extraordinarily wealthy. Sam Brannan, as we've mentioned, became California's first millionaire. His stores in Sacramento and at Sutter's Fort generated huge revenues during the early rush. But Brannan was also smart about diversification. He invested in real estate in San Francisco, buying lots that increased enormously in value as the city grew. He invested in agriculture, in hotels, and banking. By the early 1850s, Brannan was one of the most powerful men in California. His wealth built not on gold from the ground, but on gold taken from miners' pokes in exchange for necessities. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1853. Initially planning to set up a wholesale dry goods business serving his brother's New York company. He sold canvas and denim to merchants who served the mining camps. At some point, the exact story is disputed and probably embellished, Strauss or one of his associates recognized that miners needed durable pants that could withstand the hard work and rough conditions of the diggings. The pants that miners typically wore were cotton or wool, and they tore easily. Wore out quickly. Canvas or denim pants, reinforced with metal rivets at stress points, proved far more durable. Strauss began manufacturing these pants specifically for miners. They were expensive, perhaps $3 a pair, when ordinary pants might cost half that, but they lasted much longer. The miners appreciated the value and bought them readily. Levi Strauss didn't become wealthy from the gold rush itself. He arrived after the initial boom, but he built a business empire on a product that the gold rush created demand for. Those durable work pants, refined and improved over the years, eventually became what we know as blue jeans, one of America's most iconic products. The fortune that Strauss built lasted far longer than almost any fortune made from mining gold. His company still exists today, more than 170 years later. A testament to the durability of selling tools to tool users rather than trying to be a tool user yourself. The hotel and boarding house business was another avenue to wealth. In San Francisco, where every ship brought hundreds of new arrivals, accommodations were desperately scarce. An enterprising person could rent a plot of land, put up a canvas structure, fill it with cots or bunks, and charge 50 cents or $1 per night. The investment was minimal. The return substantial. Some of these tent hotels evolved into more permanent structures as lumber became available and as owners accumulated capital. The fancier hotels charged much more. $5 a night, $10, $20 for the best rooms, and they were still full. Men arriving from the east or from abroad, before heading to the mines, needed somewhere to sleep, somewhere to store their belongings, somewhere to plan their next move. They paid whatever was asked. In the mining camps themselves, the boarding house business followed a similar pattern but with even less infrastructure. A woman, one of the rare women in the camps, could make excellent money running a boarding house. She'd prepare meals, do laundry, maintain some level of cleanliness and order in the chaos of the camp. Miners, tired of cooking their own terrible food and sleeping in damp tents, would pay generously for these services. There are accounts of women in mining camps earning $40 or $50 a week, sometimes more, from cooking and laundry. This was a fortune by the standards of the time, far more than they could have earned doing the same work back east. The story of Mary Jane Megqueer illustrates this. She came to California with her husband in 1849. While he tried mining with limited success, she opened a boarding house in San Francisco. She wrote letters home describing her work, cooking 3 meals a day for 40 or 50 boarders, doing their laundry, keeping the establishment running from before dawn until late at night. The work was exhausting, but the income was substantial. She earned enough to support her family, to send money back east, to accumulate savings. When she eventually returned home to Maine, she had enough money to buy a house and live comfortably. Her husband, who'd spent months in the goldfields, had earned far less. Laundry, in fact, was one of the surprising sources of income in the gold rush. Miners would pay extraordinary amounts to have their clothes washed. $1 per shirt was common, sometimes more. Chinese immigrants often took on this work, setting up laundries in the camps and cities, working long hours in steaming wash houses, but earning steady income. A Chinese laundryman might earn $4 or $5 a day, more than most miners. The work was hard and unglamorous, but it was reliable in a way that mining never was. Food service was similarly profitable. Restaurants and eating houses, even crude ones, could charge outrageous prices. A simple meal, beans, salt pork, bread, coffee, might cost $3 or $4 in a mining camp, perhaps $2 in San Francisco. Back east, the same meal would cost 25 or 30 cents. But miners were hungry, didn't want to cook for themselves, and had gold dust to pay with. Restaurants filled constantly. The successful ones expanded, hired help, became substantial operations. The owners made far more than their customers who were digging gold. The saloon business combined several revenue streams, selling liquor, providing gambling, sometimes offering food and entertainment. Whiskey in the mining camps cost 25 cents a drink, sometimes 50 cents, when a whole bottle might cost $2 wholesale in San Francisco. The markup was astounding. A saloon owner who bought a case of whiskey for $20 could sell it by the drink for perhaps $300. The profit margins were so high that saloons multiplied rapidly. Even small camps might have 3 or 4 saloons, larger camps had dozens. Gambling was an enormous part of saloon revenue and of mining camp culture more generally. Miners, when they had gold, gambled compulsively. Card games, dice games, roulette, faro. Every form of gambling found eager participants. The games were often rigged. The odds always favoured the house, but miners played anyway. They'd work their claim all week, accumulate an ounce or two of gold dust, then lose it all in a single evening at the gaming tables. The next week they'd do it again, caught in a cycle of labour and loss that enriched the saloon owners and kept the miners perpetually poor despite their efforts. The saloon owners understood human psychology perhaps better than the miners understood geology. They created environments that encouraged spending, dim lighting, free-flowing alcohol, the camaraderie of fellow gamblers, the constant possibility of a big win that would change everything. Some saloons employed women as entertainers and companions, which drew even more customers. These women, often called hurdy-gurdy girls or painted ladies, danced with miners, encouraged them to buy drinks, sometimes provided other services. They worked on commission, earning a percentage of whatever the men they entertained spent. Some made considerable money, though the work was hard and often dangerous. Entertainment in general was profitable. Travelling theatrical companies toured the mining camps, putting on plays and musical performances in crude theatres or outdoor venues. They charged admission, $1, $2, sometimes more for popular shows, and played to packed houses. Miners starved for entertainment, for culture, for anything that reminded them of civilization, attended eagerly. The performers often earned more in a week touring the camps than they would in a month performing in eastern cities. Even simple services commanded high prices. A haircut cost 50 cents or $1. A bath at a bathhouse cost the same or more. Letter-writing services, for those who were illiterate or whose English wasn't good enough to write home, charged 25 or 50 cents per letter. Tailoring, carpentry, blacksmithing, any skilled trade was highly valued and well compensated. A blacksmith who could repair tools earned $3 or $4 a day, sometimes more. He had a steady stream of customers because mining tools broke constantly and replacements were expensive. Transportation services were crucial and profitable. The packet boats that ran up and down the Sacramento River, carrying passengers and freight between San Francisco and the inland towns, charged high fares and ran constantly. A trip that cost $2 in normal circumstances might cost $10 or $20 during the rush. The boat owners, seeing the demand, raised prices as high as the market would bear. Stagecoaches, wagon freighters, pack trains, all charged premium rates. A man who owned a string of mules for packing goods into the mountains could earn $50 a day or more, far more than the miners he was serving. Banking and financial services emerged as California's economy developed. In the early days, there were no banks in the mining districts. Miners kept their gold on their person or hidden in their tents, accepting the risk of theft. But as accumulations grew, the need for secure storage became apparent. Merchants who had safes began offering to store gold for a fee, essentially acting as informal banks. Some issued receipts that could be traded like currency. From these informal beginnings, actual banks developed. Wells Fargo, which would become one of California's major financial institutions, started as an express company in 1852, carrying gold dust, letters, and packages between the mining camps and San Francisco. The service was reliable and secure, which miners valued highly. They'd pay Wells Fargo to transport their gold to San Francisco, to deliver letters, to handle financial transactions. The fees were substantial, but the security and reliability justified the cost. Wells Fargo's owners understood that in a gold rush economy, handling gold was more profitable than digging for it. Real estate was perhaps the most dramatic source of wealth for those who positioned themselves correctly. San Francisco, as we've discussed, grew from a tiny settlement of 800 people in 1848 to a city of 25,000 by the end of 1849, and it kept growing. A lot that sold for $16 in 1847 might sell for $16,000 in 1850. Those who bought early and held on, or who had the foresight to purchase strategically located land, made fortunes that dwarfed what even the luckiest miners earned. The same pattern played out on a smaller scale in Sacramento, Stockton, Marysville, and other towns that served as gateways to the mining districts. These towns grew rapidly, needed buildings, infrastructure, services. The land they sat on increased in value dramatically. A merchant who bought a lot to build a store on found the land itself appreciating faster than his business profits. Real estate speculation became rampant, with lots changing hands multiple times, each time at a higher price, in a frenzy that resembled the later gold speculation. Agriculture and ranching profited enormously from the gold rush. California before 1848 had been primarily a ranching economy, with huge cattle herds on Mexican land grants. The gold rush created sudden massive demand for food. The existing ranchos couldn't possibly supply enough beef to feed 80,000 people, then 100,000, then more. Prices for cattle soared. A steer that might have sold for $5 in 1847 sold for $50 or $100 in 1849. Rancheros who'd been moderately wealthy became very wealthy. But the real agricultural opportunity was in supplying fresh vegetables, fruit and grain. Mining camps subsisted largely on salt pork and beans because those were the only foods that could be transported and stored without spoiling. Fresh produce was rare and expensive. A single onion might sell for $1. An apple could cost the same. Eggs, when available, cost $1 each, sometimes more. These prices created opportunities for farmers who could grow crops near the mining districts, or who could get fresh produce to market quickly. Some entrepreneurs established farms in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys, which had excellent soil and climate. They grew wheat, vegetables, fruit, raised chickens for eggs, and sold their produce to the mining camps at prices that seemed outrageous, but which miners paid willingly. These farmers worked hard, certainly, but their returns were far more reliable than mining. A farmer who planted 10 acres of potatoes and brought in a successful crop might earn several $1,000s, with relative certainty, while a miner working the same months might earn much less and faced constant uncertainty. The pattern becomes clear when we step back and look at who actually got rich during the gold rush. Some miners struck it rich. There are well-documented cases of men finding very rich claims and earning thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in a matter of months. But these were exceptions, perhaps 5% or fewer of all miners. The vast majority of miners earned modest amounts, enough to survive but not enough to accumulate significant wealth, or they earned nothing and went home broke. Meanwhile, the merchants, the service providers, the landowners, the farmers, the transporters, these people earned steady incomes that accumulated over time into substantial fortunes. They faced different risks than the miners, certainly. They invested capital, they worked hard, they dealt with the chaos and challenges of a rapidly growing frontier economy. But their odds of success were much higher than the odds facing any individual miner. This created a strange dynamic in the mining camps and towns. The miners were doing the dramatic work, the hard physical labour, taking the risks that the stories would be written about. They were the heroes of the narrative, in a sense, the ones pursuing the dream, facing the wilderness, searching for fortune. But the quiet fortunes being made were elsewhere, in the general stores, in the pack trains, in the boarding houses, in the land offices. The supporting players in the gold rush drama often ended up wealthier than the stars. There's something deeply American about this pattern, something that reveals how capitalism actually works versus how we imagine it works. The myth is that individual effort and daring bring rewards, that the person who takes the biggest risks deserves the biggest prizes, and sometimes that's true. But often, the biggest and most reliable fortunes go to those who control the infrastructure, who sell to the risk-takers rather than being risk-takers themselves, who understand that in any boom, the real money is in supplying the boomers. Levi Strauss, selling pants to miners, became far wealthier than almost any miner. Sam Brannan, selling picks and shovels, became California's first millionaire. The Wells Fargo partners, moving gold and money rather than digging for it, built an institution that lasted generations. These weren't accidents or anomalies. They were the logical outcome of understanding where value actually resided in the gold rush economy. The miners, for the most part, didn't see it this way, or didn't want to see it. They resented the high prices, complained about being gouged, accused merchants of war profiteering essentially. But they kept buying because they had no choice, and because hope eternal springs in the human breast. This week's gold dust paid this week's inflated prices, and next week there might be a big strike, and then the prices wouldn't matter, and everything would be fine. The dream sustained them through the exploitation, made it bearable, kept them working and buying and hoping. Let that pattern settle in your mind for a moment. The miners in the streams, working desperately hard for uncertain returns. The merchants in their tent stores, marking up goods and accumulating steady profits. The landowners watching their property values soar. The farmers growing vegetables that sold for incredible prices. The whole elaborate ecosystem of the gold rush economy, with gold as the catalyst, but with wealth flowing in directions that often bypass the actual gold miners entirely. This isn't to say the merchants and service providers didn't work hard or take risks. They did, but their work was different, their risks more calculable, their returns more predictable. They played a different game than the miners, and it was generally a better game if your goal was actually accumulating wealth rather than pursuing the dream of instant fortune. The gold rush created opportunities for everyone, but the opportunities weren't equal, and understanding where the real opportunities lay, that was the difference between building lasting wealth and ending up with nothing but stories and regrets. While merchants built fortunes and miners worked their claims, the mining camps themselves were developing into something that resembled society, though a society unlike anything that existed in the settled states. These were communities created almost overnight, composed almost entirely of men, with no established government, no formal law, no traditional social structures to maintain order. What emerged was fascinating and often troubling. A rough democracy mixed with mob rule, moments of genuine community spirit alongside shocking violence, codes of honor existing side by side with casual brutality. Let's explore what daily life was actually like in these camps, how people organized themselves, how they settled disputes, how they treated each other, and what this reveals about human nature when the normal constraints of civilization are removed. The demographics of the mining camps in 1849 and the early 1850s were dramatically skewed. Perhaps 95% of the population was male. Of that male population, the majority were young. In their 20s and 30s, they came from everywhere. American-born men from every state, immigrants from Europe, Chinese from the Pearl River Delta, Mexicans and Chileans from South America, Australians, Hawaiians, men from every corner of the world where news of California gold had penetrated. This diversity was remarkable for the time. A mining camp might have Americans from Maine and Georgia working claims next to Frenchmen, Germans, Irishmen, Chinese, all thrown together in the pursuit of gold. The absence of women fundamentally shaped camp culture. Women performed essential social functions in 19th century America. They maintained homes, raised children, organized social events, enforced moral standards, provided emotional support. Without women, these functions largely disappeared. The camps were rough, dirty, profane places where men reverted to bachelor habits. Or worse, domestic life barely existed. Men slept in tents or crude brush shelters, cooked terrible food over open fires, wore the same clothes until they literally fell apart, and lived in squalor that would have horrified their mothers and wives back home. The few women who did live in the mining camps occupied a complicated position. Respectable married women, usually wives who'd accompanied their husbands, were treated with exaggerated courtesy and deference. Men would stop work to tip their hats when a woman walked by, would clean up their language in her presence, would compete to help her with any task. This wasn't always welcome attention. Being the only woman among hundreds or thousands of men could be uncomfortable and even frightening, but it reflected the value the camps placed on traditional femininity and domesticity. Other women in the camps occupied different social positions. There were women who ran boarding houses, laundries, restaurants. There were dance hall girls and prostitutes whose presence was tolerated and whose services were in high demand. The line between respectable and non-respectable women was policed carefully by the camps, though the standards were often arbitrary. A woman running a boarding house was respectable. A woman working in a saloon might or might not be, depending on exactly what work she did. The moral categories that governed women's lives back east applied in California, but they were complicated by the fact that any woman brave or desperate enough to be in a mining camp was already doing something unusual. The camps had no formal government initially. California wouldn't become a state until September of 1850, and even then state authority barely reached into the remote mining districts for years. So the miners created their own systems of governance, rough but surprisingly effective. Each camp developed its own rules, usually based on common sense and shared interest. The most important rules concerned mining claims, how large a claim could be, how you established ownership. What happened if you abandoned a claim temporarily? These rules were enforced by the miners themselves through camp meetings. If a dispute arose, the interested parties would call for a meeting. All the miners in the camp would gather, elect a temporary chairman and perhaps a jury, hear both sides of the argument, and render a verdict. The proceedings were informal, but generally fair. Both sides got to present their case, witnesses were called, evidence was examined. Then the assembled miners voted on the outcome, or the elected jury deliberated and announced a decision. This system of rough justice worked reasonably well for mining disputes and property claims. It worked less well for criminal cases, where mob passion could override fairness. Theft was treated harshly because in a mining camp trust was essential. If you couldn't trust the man working the claim next to yours, if you had to constantly guard your possessions, if theft became common, the whole social structure would collapse. So thieves, when caught, were punished severely. The punishments were immediate and physical. Whipping was common. The convicted thief would be tied to a tree or post and given perhaps 20 or 50 lashes with a rope or leather strap, enough to hurt terribly but not usually to cause permanent injury. Public humiliation was part of the punishment. The whole camp would watch, and the man whipped was then expected to leave the camp and not return. For serious theft, particularly theft of gold or of supplies that meant survival, the punishment could be death. The convicted man would be hanged, usually from a convenient tree, with the whole camp watching. These executions happened often enough that they stopped being shocking, became just another feature of camp life. The troubling thing about this rough justice is how easily it could shade into mob violence. When emotions ran high, when the accused was unpopular or different or foreign, the pretense of fairness could disappear entirely. A Chinese miner accused of theft might be convicted on flimsy evidence and punished more harshly than an American accused of the same crime. A Mexican miner might be driven from his claim with no hearing at all. The democratic forms were observed, meetings were held, votes were taken, but the outcomes were often predetermined by prejudice. The treatment of Chinese miners reveals the racism that permeated the camps despite their democratic pretensions. Chinese men arrived in California in large numbers, perhaps 25,000 by 1852. They worked hard, lived frugally, often worked claims that others had abandoned as played out, patiently extracting gold that less patient miners had missed. They sent money home to families in China, accumulated savings, supported each other through clan associations and mutual aid societies. The American and European miners resented Chinese success. They complained that Chinese miners worked for less, that they undercut American wages, that they were somehow cheating by working harder and living more cheaply. These complaints made no logical sense. There was no wage labour in place of mining. Each man worked for himself. But logic wasn't the point. The point was that Chinese success challenged American assumptions about racial superiority and about who deserved to profit from California's gold. In 1850, California passed the foreign miners' tax, which required non-American miners to pay $20 per month for the privilege of mining. The tax was aimed primarily at Chinese and Mexican miners, though technically it applied to all foreign-born miners. $20 a month was an enormous sum, more than most miners earned. The tax was impossible to pay and was designed to drive foreign miners out of the gold fields. It succeeded partially. Many Chinese and Mexican miners left or moved to more remote areas where the tax wasn't enforced. But many others stayed, paid the tax when they had to, evaded it when they could, and continued mining. Violence against Chinese miners was common and often went unpunished. Chinese camps were raided, their equipment destroyed, their gold stolen. Individual Chinese miners were beaten, killed, driven away from good claims. The perpetrators rarely faced consequences because juries of American miners wouldn't convict, or because camp officials didn't bother investigating crimes against Chinese victims. This was terrorism, essentially economic violence designed to eliminate competition and to maintain racial hierarchy. Mexican and Chilean miners faced similar treatment. They'd come from established mining regions in South America, often had more mining expertise than American miners, and were frequently successful. This success bred resentment. In some camps, foreign miners were forbidden to work claims, were restricted to certain areas, or were simply driven out by threats or violence. The democratic self-governance of the camps extended only to those considered full members of the community, which in practice meant white American men. Everyone else existed in a precarious position, tolerated when convenient, expelled or attacked when they became too successful or numerous. Native Americans faced the worst treatment of all. California's indigenous peoples had lived in the Sierra Nevada foothills for thousands of years, with established villages, complex societies, and intimate knowledge of the land. The gold rush destroyed their world with shocking speed. Miners invaded their territories, drove away the game that native peoples depended on, diverted streams for mining that had been sources of fish and water, destroyed acorn groves and other food sources. Native communities that had sustained themselves for generations suddenly faced starvation. Some Native Americans worked as laborers for miners or for ranchers, earning subsistence wages. Others tried to maintain their traditional ways but found it increasingly impossible as their resource base disappeared. Conflicts were inevitable. When Native Americans took cattle or horses, animals that hadn't existed in California before Spanish colonization, so the concept of stealing them was foreign to native ethics, white miners and settlers responded with organized violence. Groups of miners would form posses, raid native villages, kill men, women, and children indiscriminately. These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic campaigns of extermination. The California state government supported this violence through official policy. Militias were formed and funded to fight Indian wars. A bounty system paid for native scalps or heads. The stated goal was clearing California of native peoples to make room for white settlement and mining. The result was genocide, though the word wasn't used at the time. California's native population, which had been perhaps 300,000 before American colonization, declined to perhaps 30,000 by 1860. Disease killed many, but so did systematic violence and starvation. The gold rush wasn't just an economic event, it was a catastrophe for California's original inhabitants. Life in the mining camps for the American and European miners who made up the majority population was governed by unwritten codes of behavior. You didn't jump another man's claim. You helped neighbors in genuine need. You paid your debts. You could be trusted with borrowed tools or supplies. These codes weren't always followed, but they were acknowledged, and men who violated them faced social sanctions, being ostracized, being refused help when they needed it, being driven from the camp. There was a rough egalitarianism in the camps that was unusual for the time. A man's past didn't matter as much as his present behavior. Former lawyers and former laborers worked side by side, equal in their current circumstances. Former slaves found a degree of freedom in California that didn't exist in the South, though they still faced racism and discrimination. The camps were more meritocratic than Eastern society, or at least they claimed to be. What mattered was whether you worked hard, whether you could be trusted, whether you pulled your weight. But this egalitarianism had strict limits. It applied only to white men, and even among white men, there were hierarchies. Americans generally considered themselves superior to European immigrants. Northern Europeans ranked above Southern Europeans. English speakers had advantages over those who spoke other languages. These hierarchies weren't formalized, but they shaped who got the best claims, who was believed in disputes, who had social standing in the camps. The camps were intensely social despite their rough conditions. Men craved company, conversation, connection. After work, they'd gather around fires, sharing food and stories. They gambled. Card games were constant, with men betting the day's findings, their tools, sometimes their clothes. They drank. Whiskey was expensive but in constant demand, providing temporary escape from the hardship and boredom. They argued politics, argued about mining techniques, argued about anything and everything just to have the stimulation of debate. Sunday was theoretically a day of rest. And many camps enforced this through social pressure. Some miners observed Sunday for religious reasons, attending makeshift church services when travelling preachers made it to the camps. Others observed it simply because rest was necessary, because working 7 days a week would break down even the strongest constitution. Sunday was for washing clothes, repairing tools, writing letters home, sleeping late, gambling, drinking, socializing. The camps on Sunday had a different character, less focused, more relaxed, more like actual communities than collections of isolated workers. Mail call, as mentioned earlier, was a major social event. But so were other arrivals from the outside world, a travelling theatre company, a circus, a famous speaker, even just a merchant with a fresh load of supplies and newspapers from San Francisco. These connections to the broader world were cherished. Newspapers, even if they were weeks old by the time they reached the camps, were read and reread, passed around until they fell apart. A miner who received a newspaper from back east would share it, reading articles aloud to groups of men hungry for any news from home. The camps developed their own folklore and songs. Stories circulated about remarkable gold finds, about lucky strikes and tragic losses, about eccentric characters and dramatic events. These stories were embellished in the retelling, becoming legends that expressed the camp's values and anxieties. Songs were adapted from old tunes with new lyrics about mining life. Men sang while working when their spirits were high, sang around evening fires, sang to relieve boredom and loneliness. Violence, beyond the organized violence against Native Americans and Chinese miners, was fairly common, but not constant. Most miners weren't violent men, but they were young men living in all-male environments with ready access to alcohol and guns, with no law enforcement beyond themselves, with the constant stress and frustration of hard work and uncertain reward. Fights broke out over disputed claims, over perceived insults, over gambling debts, over women, over nothing much at all. These fights were usually fist fights, rough but not deadly, and they typically ended when one man was clearly beaten or when others pulled the fighters apart. Gunfights and knife fights happened too, less frequently than later Western mythology suggests, but often enough. A man who felt seriously wronged, or who was drunk and angry, or who simply had a violent temper might resort to weapons. The camps had their share of killings, some justified as self-defense, some clearly murder. Most falling into a grey area where blame was hard to assign. These killings were sometimes punished through the rough justice system, sometimes ignored if the deceased wasn't well liked or was foreign, sometimes avenged by friends of the deceased in a cycle of violence. The large camps developed more structure over time, businesses became more established, buildings replaced tents, some degree of civil organisation emerged. Rich Bar or Hangtown in 1852 looked different from the same places in 1849. There were stores in actual buildings, hotels with rooms, restaurants with tables and chairs, even primitive schools in a few places where families had settled. The wild frontier character remained, but it was being slowly civilized. But even as the camps developed more structure, they remained fundamentally unstable. Mining camps rose and fell with the fortunes of the local diggings. When gold was found in a new location, a camp would spring up literally overnight, growing to hundreds or thousands of residents in weeks. When the easily accessible gold was exhausted, people left just as quickly, moving to the next promising area. Some camps that had been bustling communities in 1850 were ghost towns by 1852. Just empty tents and abandoned sluices. The population moved on to the next rush. This impermanence shaped the camp's character. People didn't invest in permanence because they expected to move. They didn't plant gardens or build substantial houses or create institutions that required long-term commitment. They lived for today, for this claim, for this season. Tomorrow might bring a big strike that would change everything, or tomorrow might bring exhaustion of the local gold and departure for somewhere else. The uncertainty was constant, and it prevented the development of the kind of stable communities that existed in the settled states. Let that world settle in your mind for a moment. These rough mining camps scattered through the Sierra Nevada foothills, each one a temporary community of men from everywhere, living in difficult conditions, working desperately hard, governing themselves through rough democracy that sometimes delivered justice and sometimes delivered mob violence. The camps were both better and worse than settled society, more democratic and more brutal, more egalitarian and more racist, more free and more dangerous. They were laboratories of human behaviour, showing what happens when you remove normal social structures and throw together diverse people in pursuit of the same dream. The results were mixed. As human results always are, moments of cooperation and generosity alongside exploitation and violence, genuine community feeling alongside deep divisions, democracy in principle practiced unevenly in reality. The gold rush created fortunes and built communities, yes, but it also destroyed landscapes and peoples in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend without seeing the evidence that remains even today. Let's turn our attention now to what was lost during those frenzied years, to the costs that were paid by those who had no voice in deciding whether the gold rush should happen, and to the environmental devastation that would take generations to even partially heal. This part of the story is darker, sadder, but it's essential to understanding the full impact of what occurred in California between 1848 and the middle 1850s. Begin with the land itself, with the streams and hillsides where gold was found. Before the miners arrived, these were living ecosystems that had existed in rough balance for thousands of years. The streams ran clear, supporting salmon runs that native peoples depended on. The hillsides were covered with oak and pine and manzanita, hosting deer and bear and countless smaller creatures. The meadows were rich with native grasses and wildflowers. It was beautiful country, productive country country that sustained both wildlife and human populations without degrading. Placer mining, the simple panning and sluicing that characterized the early gold rush, disrupted these systems but didn't destroy them completely. A man with a pan or a rocker moved gravel around, muddied the water, disturbed the stream bed, but the damage was localized and temporary. When he moved on, the stream would recover in a season or two. But as the easy gold disappeared and miners sought more efficient methods, the techniques became more destructive. Hydraulic mining, which emerged in the early 1850s and reached its peak in the decades that followed, was environmental destruction on an industrial scale. The concept was simple but devastating. Use high-pressure water cannons called monitors to wash away entire hillsides, running the liquefied earth through sluices to separate out the gold. Imagine a stream of water as thick as a man's torso shooting from a metal nozzle with pressure sufficient to kill a person instantly, directed at a hillside. The water cuts into the earth like a knife, undermining the slope, bringing down tons of material in landslides and floods of mud. The monitors operated continuously, day and night when water was available. They consumed enormous amounts of water, requiring the construction of elaborate canal systems, ditches and flumes that diverted entire streams and rivers to provide the necessary flow. The water, mixed with liquefied hillside, ran through long sluice boxes where the gold settled out. The waste material, everything that wasn't gold, which was nearly everything, washed downstream as a thick slurry of mud and gravel. This slurry buried valleys downstream, filled in stream beds, destroyed farmland, and changed the very geography of the region. Rivers that had run clear for millennia ran brown with sediment. The mud settled in the valleys, sometimes tens of feet deep, burying productive agricultural land under sterile debris. The towns of Marysville and Yuba City, in the Sacramento Valley downstream from major hydraulic mining operations, experienced repeated flooding as the riverbeds filled with debris and raised the water level. The farmers in these valleys watched helplessly as their fields disappeared under mining waste, their crops ruined, their livelihoods destroyed. The legal battles between farmers and miners over hydraulic mining waste would continue for decades. The farmers sued, arguing that the mining companies were destroying their property. The mining companies argued that they had a right to mine, that California's prosperity depended on it, that a few farmers couldn't stand in the way of progress. The court struggled with the question, eventually ruling in 1884 that hydraulic mining that sent debris into navigable waterways was illegal. But by then, the damage was done. Millions of cubic yards of earth had been moved, valleys had been filled, landscapes had been permanently altered. Even today, more than 170 years later, you can see the scars. The hydraulic mining pits remain, barren cliffs and gullies where hillsides used to be. The vegetation has returned in some places, but the land has never recovered its original character. Rivers still carry elevated levels of sediment. The thick layers of mining debris in the Central Valley still lie beneath the surface, affecting drainage and agriculture. The gold rush literally reshaped California's physical landscape. Mercury pollution was another environmental disaster, one whose effects persist to this day. Mercury, or quicksilver as it was called, is liquid at room temperature and has the useful property of amalgamating with gold, combining with it to form a soft paste that's easy to collect. Miners discovered that adding mercury to their sluice boxes improved gold recovery. The gold-mercury amalgam could be collected, then heated to drive off the mercury as vapor, leaving pure gold behind. This process seemed efficient, but it was catastrophically polluting. The mercury vapor released during heating is toxic, causing nerve damage, kidney damage, mental illness, and death in those exposed to it. The miners who did the heating often suffered from mercury poisoning, though they didn't understand the cause. They called it being, quote, 11 from the similar symptoms suffered by hat makers who used mercury in felt production. The symptoms included tremors, mood swings, difficulty thinking, gradual mental deterioration. Many miners who worked with mercury regularly died young, or spent their later years mentally impaired. But the individual health effects were only part of the problem. Not all the mercury amalgamated with gold. Some of it escaped into the environment, into the sluice water, into the streams, into the soil. Estimates suggest that perhaps 7,000 tons of mercury were used in California gold mining during the 19th century. And much of that mercury went into the environment where it remains today, working its way through the food chain, contaminating fish and wildlife, posing health risks to anyone who eats fish from certain California waters. Mercury is essentially permanent in the environment. It doesn't break down or disappear. It converts between different chemical forms, sometimes settling in sediment, sometimes moving through water, sometimes accumulating in living organisms. Today, more than 170 years after the height of the gold rush, there are still fish consumption advisories for parts of the Sacramento and San Joaquin river systems because of mercury contamination from gold mining. The poison that miners released in the 1850s is still causing harm. The destruction of salmon runs was another consequence of mining activity. Salmon had been central to the Native American diet and economy in California for thousands of years. Every fall, millions of salmon would swim up the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers and their tributaries to spawn, providing reliable, abundant food. The native peoples built their seasonal rounds around the salmon runs, gathering at traditional fishing sites, catching and preserving fish to last through the winter. Mining destroyed this system. The muddy water from placer mining made it difficult or impossible for salmon to navigate, to find suitable spawning grounds to survive at all. The hydraulic mining sediment buried spawning gravels under feet of mud and fine sediment. Dams built to create reservoirs for mining water blocked salmon migration routes. The streams that had sustained salmon runs for millennia became uninhabitable for the fish. The salmon population collapsed. By the 1860s and 70s, runs that had numbered in the millions were reduced to thousands. Some runs disappeared entirely. The fish that had used particular streams for thousands of generations simply gone, extinct. The native peoples who depended on salmon faced starvation. The ecological relationships that had sustained them were broken, their food sources destroyed, their entire way of life rendered impossible. The loss of the salmon was both a biological tragedy and a cultural catastrophe. The fishing sites that had been gathering places for native communities, places where families came together, where traditional knowledge was passed down, where social bonds were maintained, these sites became useless, abandoned. The stories and ceremonies and practices centered around salmon fishing, developed over thousands of years, lost their context and began to disappear from memory. When you destroy a species, you don't just lose the biological organism. You lose all the cultural knowledge and practice and meaning that had developed in relationship with it. Deforestation accompanied mining, particularly as the industry developed and required timber for elaborate structures. Mining operations needed lumber for sluice boxes, for flumes, for buildings, for shoring up tunnels in hard rock mining. The demand was enormous. Old-growth forests of pine and fir. Trees that had stood for hundreds or thousands of years were cut down and milled. The logs were dragged out by oxen or horses or floated down streams during high water, a process that further damaged stream beds and watersheds. The cutting wasn't selective or careful. Loggers took the best trees, the biggest and straightest, leaving behind a landscape of stumps and slash. In some areas, the deforestation was so complete that soil erosion accelerated dramatically. Without tree roots to hold the soil, winter rains washed it away, creating gullies and further degrading the landscape. The loss of forest cover also affected water cycles, reducing the land's ability to absorb and slowly release water, making floods more severe and droughts more intense. For California's native peoples, the gold rush was an unmitigated catastrophe, the culmination of a process of colonization that had begun with Spanish missionaries but which accelerated to genocidal intensity during the gold rush years. Let's think carefully about what happened to the indigenous peoples of California and what that means. Before European contact, California had perhaps 300,000 native inhabitants living in hundreds of distinct communities with different languages, cultures, and ways of life. They had lived in California for at least 12,000 years, developing intimate knowledge of the land, complex social organizations, rich cultural traditions. They managed the land through controlled burning, which maintained oak savannas and grasslands, promoted the growth of useful plants, reduced catastrophic wildfires. The landscape that the 49ers thought was pristine wilderness was actually carefully tended, the result of thousands of years of human management. The Spanish mission period, from 1769 to 1833, had been terrible for native peoples. Missions concentrated native populations, exposed them to European diseases to which they had no immunity, disrupted traditional ways of life, and often treated them brutally. The native population declined significantly during this period, though communities in the interior, away from the missions, remained largely intact. The gold rush brought a different kind of destruction, faster, more chaotic, more violent. The 49ers invaded native territories, destroyed food sources and brought diseases. When native peoples resisted, or when they simply tried to survive by taking cattle or horses from the invaders, the miners responded with systematic violence. Armed groups of miners would raid native villages, killing everyone they found, burning dwellings, destroying food stores. These attacks were often described in contemporary accounts as quote 12 or quote 13, but they were more accurately massacres. Campaigns of extermination. California state policy encouraged this violence. In 1850, the state passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which, despite its name, largely served to facilitate the exploitation and destruction of native peoples. The Act allowed white Californians to essentially enslave native people, particularly children, under the guise of apprenticeship or indenture. Native children were kidnapped and sold, legally, to white families or businesses as labourers. The law also denied native people the right to testify in court against white people, making it impossible for them to seek legal protection or justice. The state funded militia campaigns against native peoples, paying volunteers to hunt down and kill native Californians. A bounty system paid for scalps or heads as proof of kills. These were official government-sanctioned policies of genocide. The goal, stated openly, was to clear California of its native population to make room for white settlement and economic development. The extermination was systematic, deliberate, and effective. Between 1848 and 1870, California's native population declined from perhaps 150,000 to perhaps 30,000. Some of this decline was due to disease, measles, smallpox, cholera, influenza, diseases that swept through communities already weakened by starvation and violence. But much of it was direct killing. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of California native people were murdered during this period in attacks both official and unofficial, in organized massacres and individual killings. Those who survived faced impossible choices. Their traditional territories were overrun, their food sources destroyed, their communities scattered. Some sought refuge in the most remote areas, trying to maintain traditional ways despite starvation and constant threat. Others moved to reservations, small parcels of land, usually the worst land nobody else wanted, where they were supposed to live under government supervision. The reservations were poorly supplied, often corrupt, and offered little real protection. Many native people worked as labourers for white ranchers or farmers, earning minimal wages, living in poverty, their children often taken away under the apprenticeship laws. The cultural destruction was as devastating as the physical destruction. Languages were lost as communities were destroyed, and children were forcibly removed to white households or Indian schools. Traditional knowledge about plant management, about seasonal rounds, about stories and ceremonies and songs, this knowledge was held by elders, And when the elders were killed, or when communities were so disrupted that the transmission of knowledge broke down, the knowledge disappeared. Entire ways of understanding the world, accumulated over thousands of years, vanished in a generation or two. Consider what this means in human terms. Imagine your entire community destroyed, your family killed, your children taken away, your land occupied by strangers who consider you less than human. Imagine your language forbidden, your spiritual practices outlawed, your entire way of life rendered impossible. This is what California's native peoples experienced during the gold rush and its aftermath. This is the cost that was paid for the gold that built San Francisco and enriched the merchants and miners. The Chinese miners, while they weren't targeted for extermination like native peoples, faced their own forms of systematic discrimination and violence. The foreign miners' tax extracted money from those least able to pay. Chinese camps were frequently raided by white miners who stole gold, destroyed equipment, and beat or killed the inhabitants. When Chinese miners tried to seek protection or justice through the legal system, they found the courts closed to them. California law prohibited Chinese people from testifying against white people in court, meaning crimes against Chinese victims went unpunished because the victims couldn't testify about what had happened to them. The Chinese community responded by organizing self-protection associations, by working in groups for safety, by developing their own internal systems of justice and mutual aid since they couldn't rely on the broader society. They persisted despite the hostility, continuing to mine, continuing to send money home, continuing to build Chinese communities in California that would become permanent even as the gold rush faded. Mexican and Chilean miners, who had come from established mining regions and often had more expertise than American miners, were also targeted. The foreign miners' tax was partly aimed at them. They were accused of taking gold that rightfully belonged to Americans, though California had been Mexican territory just months before the gold discovery, and the concept of American rightful ownership was dubious at best. Many were driven from their claims through threats or violence. Some fought back, creating a cycle of ethnic conflict that simmered throughout the gold rush period. The environmental and human costs of the gold rush were rarely acknowledged at the time. The newspapers celebrated California's progress, the growth of its population, the wealth being created, the transformation of a wilderness into civilization. The destruction of native peoples was seen as unfortunate but necessary, the price of progress. The environmental damage was barely noticed, or was considered simply the cost of mining. The suffering of Chinese and Mexican miners was dismissed or justified by racist assumptions about who deserved the benefits of California's gold. But the costs were real, and they were borne by those with the least power to resist or to demand accountability. The native peoples who had lived in California for thousands of years paid with their lives, their cultures, their entire worlds. The land paid in damaged watersheds, poisoned streams, destroyed forests, landscapes that would take more than a century to even begin to heal. The Chinese and Mexican miners paid in violence and exploitation and stolen labor. These costs subsidized the fortunes that others made possible the rapid development of California, created the foundation for the state's later prosperity. Let these costs settle in your mind for a moment. The environmental destruction that's still visible, still causing problems today, the mercury still in the rivers, the scarred hillsides where hydraulic mining tore away the earth, the salmon runs that never recovered. And most of all, the genocide of California's native peoples, the destruction of cultures and communities and ways of life that had existed for millennia, erased in barely a generation to make way for gold mining and settlement. This is the shadow side of the gold rush, the part of the story that's uncomfortable and painful but essential to understanding what really happened, what it really cost, who really paid the price for the gold that built California. The devastation and the violence that characterized the gold rush eventually gave way to something different, though whether to call it progress or simply change is a question worth considering. By the early 1850s, the easy gold was largely gone. The nature of mining was transforming, and California itself was becoming something other than a collection of temporary camps scattered through the foothills. Let's explore this transition, this shift from boom to something more stable, and what it meant for the different people who had come to California seeking fortune, or escape, or transformation. The placer gold, the gold that could be recovered by individual miners with simple tools, was depleting rapidly. The richest claims had been worked over multiple times, each successive miner extracting a little less than the previous one. By 1852 or 1853, a miner working an average claim might find a quarter ounce a day if he was lucky, more often just a few pennyweights, sometimes nothing at all. The easy money was gone, if it had ever really existed for most miners. What remained required more effort, more capital, more sophisticated techniques to extract. Quartz mining, also called hard rock mining, represented the next phase. The placer gold in the streams had eroded from veins of gold-bearing quartz in the mountains. If you could find these veins and extract the gold from the rock, the potential rewards were enormous. But quartz mining required completely different methods from placer mining. You had to dig into solid rock, extract ore, crush it to powder, then process the powder to separate out the gold. This required equipment, machinery, substantial investment. A quartz mining operation might cost thousands of dollars to establish. You needed to sink a shaft into the mountain following the vein. This required timber for shoring up the shaft, tools for drilling and blasting, explosives, pumps to remove water that seeped into the shaft. Once you extracted the ore, you needed a stamp mill to crush it, a massive machine with heavy iron stamps that pounded the ore into powder. Driven by water power or steam, then you needed chemicals and more processing to extract the gold from the powder. The whole operation required capital that no individual miner possessed, so quartz mining became corporate from the beginning. Groups of investors would form joint stock companies, pool capital, purchase mining claims, and build the necessary infrastructure. They would hire miners as wage labourers rather than each man working for himself. This was a fundamental shift in the nature of gold mining, from individual entrepreneurship to industrial wage labour. The miners who had come to California to be independent, to work for themselves, found themselves working for wages again, often for less money than they'd hoped to make finding gold on their own. Some individual miners made this transition successfully, buying shares in mining companies, becoming supervisors or skilled workers in quartz operations. Others resisted, continuing to work placer claims that were increasingly marginal, refusing to accept that the era of independent mining was ending. Still others gave up entirely on mining and turned to other occupations, farming, ranching, working in the growing towns, anything that offered more reliable income than the exhausted placer fields. The decision to stay in California or to return home was one that every miner eventually faced. Some had come intending to spend a year or two in the gold fields, make a fortune, and return home wealthy. For most, the fortune never materialized. After a year or two of hard work, of occasional small fines and frequent disappointment, they faced a choice. Return home with little to show for the effort, admitting failure, or stay in California and try something else, accepting that the dream of easy gold was finished but hoping that California still offered better opportunities than wherever they'd come from. Many chose to stay. Perhaps they'd developed skills that were valuable in California. Farming, carpentry, storekeeping, whatever work they'd fallen into. Perhaps they'd formed friendships and connections that made California feel like home. Perhaps they were too ashamed to return home having failed, or perhaps they'd simply grown to like California despite its hardships. The landscape was beautiful, the climate in the valleys was mild, the sense of possibility remained even if the specific possibility of finding gold had diminished. California in the early 1850s was still a place where a man could reinvent himself, could build something new, could escape whatever he was running from back east, The miners who stayed often sent for their families, wives and children who'd been left behind waiting for the miner to return wealthy, instead received letters asking them to come to California. This was a difficult request. The journey was long and dangerous, the destination uncertain. The whole venture required faith that California would be better than staying home. But many families came, making the same difficult journey their husbands and fathers had made months or years before, reuniting in California and beginning to build permanent lives there. The arrival of women and families changed California's character fundamentally. The rough mining camps began to transform into actual towns. Schools were established for the children. Churches were built, bringing religious structure and social organization. The saloons and gambling halls remained, but they were now balanced by domestic spaces, by homes and gardens, and the civilizing influence of women and families. The men who'd lived as bachelors, eating terrible food and sleeping in tents, now had homes to return to, wives who insisted on basic standards of cleanliness and behavior, children who needed education and stability. Towns like Sacramento, Stockton, and Marysville, which had started as supply points for the mining districts, became substantial cities with permanent buildings, civic institutions, commercial life beyond just serving miners. San Francisco's growth was even more dramatic. From 800 residents in 1848, it had grown to perhaps 30,000 by 1850, and it continued growing. The city was repeatedly destroyed by fires. The wood frame buildings and tents were incredibly flammable, and fires swept through regularly. But it was rebuilt each time, often with more substantial structures. By the middle 1850s, San Francisco was becoming a real city, with brick buildings, banks, newspapers, theatres, a cultural life that rivaled eastern cities. The economic base of California was diversifying beyond gold mining. Agriculture emerged as a major industry, taking advantage of California's excellent climate and soil. The Central Valley proved ideal for growing wheat, which became California's first major agricultural export. Farmers in the valley could produce wheat at competitive prices and ship it to markets in the east or even internationally. Fruit growing began in the foothills and coastal valleys. Grapes for wine, oranges, apples, pears. Ranching continued and expanded, with cattle providing beef for the still substantial mining population and for export. California's admission as a state in September of 1850 provided governmental structure that had been lacking. The state constitution, written in 1849, was remarkably progressive in some ways and deeply flawed in others. It granted voting rights to white men regardless of property ownership, which was more democratic than many eastern states. It recognized some property rights for married women, which was unusual for the time, but it also explicitly prohibited black people from voting, from testifying in court, from accessing equal education. Native Americans were similarly excluded from citizenship and its protections. The state government, while bringing order and structure, also formalized racial hierarchies and discrimination. The land ownership situation in California was complicated by the transition from Mexican to American rule. Under Mexican law, large land grants had been made to individuals and families, creating the rancho system. These grants were supposed to be honored under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but American settlers and the American legal system found ways to undermine Mexican land titles. Grant holders were required to prove their ownership in American courts, a process that was expensive, time-consuming, and often conducted in English by judges unsympathetic to Mexican claimants. Many grants were lost through this legal process, or were sold off piece by piece to pay legal fees. The land passed from Mexican ranchero families to American settlers and speculators, another form of dispossession that accompanied California's transformation. For the Chinese community in California, the early 1850s brought both growth and increasing hostility. The Chinese population continued to increase, perhaps 25,000 by 1852, perhaps 40,000 by 1860. They established communities in San Francisco and the mining towns, creating institutions that provided support and structure, family associations, mutual aid societies, temples, businesses serving the Chinese population. They worked as miners when they could, as labourers when mining became impossible, in laundries and restaurants and other service industries. But the racial hostility intensified as well. The foreign miners' tax continued to extract money from Chinese miners. Violent attacks on Chinese camps and individuals continued. Anti-Chinese sentiment, based on racist assumptions about Chinese being fundamentally different and inferior, became embedded in California culture. This hostility would eventually lead to exclusionary laws and policies that would formalize discrimination and severely restrict Chinese immigration. But in the early 1850s, the hostility was still mostly informal, expressed through violence and social exclusion rather than formal legal barriers. Some miners did strike it rich during this transitional period, though their stories were increasingly exceptional rather than typical. There were still discoveries of rich pockets of gold, still occasional finds that made a man wealthy overnight. These stories circulated through the mining districts, through California, back to the States and around the world, maintaining the myth that California gold was still available for the taking. But the reality was that most people who became wealthy in California in the early 1850s did so through business, through land speculation, through agriculture, through providing services, not through mining. The return journey for those who gave up and went home was often as difficult as the original journey to California. If you'd come around Cape Horn, you faced another 6 or 8 months at sea to get back. If you'd come overland, you faced the same grueling trek across the continent, though now with established trails and somewhat better infrastructure. If you'd come via Panama, you faced the same disease-ridden crossing of the isthmus, and you made these journeys, often with little money, having spent everything you had in California with minimal return. Some men worked their way home, taking jobs on ships or joining wagon trains as hired help. Doing whatever was necessary to get back to the States, those who returned home faced questions and judgments. Where was the gold you went to find? Why did you fail when others succeeded? The returnee might make excuses, might tell stories of bad luck or poor claims or unfair treatment, might blame external circumstances rather than admitting that the whole venture had been based on exaggerated hopes and insufficient understanding of what mining actually entailed. Or he might be honest, admitting that California was harder than expected, that the gold was scarce, that the stories had been misleading. Either way, the return was often anticlimactic, deflating, a recognition that years had been spent on a dream that didn't materialize. But some returnees brought back enough to make the venture worthwhile, if not quite successful. A man who'd earned perhaps $2,000 or $3,000 over 2 or 3 years in California, working both placer claims and wage labour, might return home with $1,000 saved. This wasn't a fortune, but it was meaningful capital that could be invested in a farm or business, that could provide a start for a family, that could make a real difference in life prospects. These modest successes were perhaps more common than complete failures or spectacular successes, but they're less dramatic, less memorable, less likely to be written about. The transformation of California from gold rush frontier to settled state happened remarkably quickly. In 1848, California had been a backwater, a thinly populated territory recently seized from Mexico, of interest to almost no one outside of its own residents. By 1855, it was a state with nearly 300,000 people, with substantial cities, with developing agriculture and industry, with railroads beginning to connect the interior to the coast, with regular steamship service to the East Coast and to Asia, with a complex economy and society. This transformation had been violent, chaotic, destructive, and remarkably productive all at once. The gold production itself, which had driven this entire transformation, peaked in the early 1850s and then began a long decline. The total gold extracted from California during the rush years is estimated at perhaps $2 billion worth at the time, which would be worth many times more in current dollars. This was an enormous amount of wealth. But it was distributed very unevenly. A few people became very wealthy. Many more earned decent livings for a few years. Most earned little or lost money on the venture. The overall economic impact on California and the United States was significant. The gold helped finance development, provided capital for investment, put money into circulation, but the individual outcomes varied dramatically. The environmental damage was permanent in many ways. The landscape had been transformed, forests cut. Hillsides washed away, rivers filled with sediment, mercury spread throughout watersheds. The salmon runs were destroyed or severely damaged. The native ecosystems were disrupted, replaced with new assemblages of plants and animals, some native, some introduced. California would never return to its pre-gold rush state, could never return because the changes were too fundamental, too extensive. What emerged was a new California, modified by human activity on a scale that had never occurred before in the region. For California's native peoples, the gold rush and early statehood period was catastrophic, as we've discussed. But survival was possible, and some communities did survive, adapting to impossible circumstances, maintaining cultural continuity despite every effort to destroy it. The survival of California native peoples through this period, the persistence of languages and cultural practices and identities despite genocide and dispossession, is a testament to human resilience and to the strength of cultural ties. But the survival came at enormous cost, and the losses of people, of land, of knowledge, of ways of life were devastating and permanent. By the middle 1850s, California had settled into a new pattern. The frenzied rush was over. Though mining continued and would continue for decades, the get-rich-quick dreamers had mostly left or had settled into more sustainable occupations. The state was developing infrastructure, institutions, a sense of permanence. The population was becoming more balanced between men and women, more stable, more rooted. California was becoming a place where people built lives rather than just seeking quick fortunes. But the legacy of the gold rush remained. It shaped California's culture, its economy, its demographics, its very identity. The idea of California as a place of opportunity, of reinvention, of striking it rich, this idea was born in the gold rush and persisted long after the gold was gone. The environmental damage remained. The racial hierarchies and conflicts established during the rush continued to shape California society. The fortunes made during the rush by merchants, landowners, bankers became the foundation for California's later economic development. Let this transition settle in your mind. From the chaos of 1849 to the relative stability of 1855, from the desperate search for placer gold to the development of industrial mining and diverse economy, from temporary camps to permanent towns and cities, from bachelor miners to families building homes, from Mexican California to American California, from frontier to state. The transformation was rapid and profound, built on gold but sustained by much more than gold, achieved through both remarkable human effort and terrible human cost, creating a California that was new and different and would continue to evolve into something the 49ers wouldn't have recognized or perhaps even wanted. The bust wasn't sudden or complete. Gold mining continued for generations, but the rush itself, the frenzied moment when anything seemed possible, when fortunes could be made overnight, when California was the destination for dreams from around the world, that moment passed, replaced by something more ordinary but also more enduring. As California settled into statehood and the frenzied rush years faded into memory, it's worth stepping back and contemplating what the gold rush actually meant. What it revealed, what patterns it established that would repeat in different forms throughout American history. The legacy of those years extends far beyond the gold that was extracted, far beyond the population growth and economic development. The gold rush shaped how Americans think about opportunity, about the West, about themselves. Let's explore this legacy thoughtfully, considering both what was gained and what the costs reveal about human nature and American character. The total amount of gold extracted from California during the rush years and the decades that followed is difficult to measure precisely, but estimates suggest perhaps 12 million ounces were recovered between 1848 and 1860, worth roughly $250 million at the time. If we extend the timeline through the end of the 19th century, the total reaches perhaps 50 million ounces, worth about $1 billion in period currency. These are enormous sums, particularly for the mid-19th century when the entire federal budget was measured in tens of millions of dollars. But here's the question that matters. Who actually benefited from this wealth? We've already explored how merchants and suppliers often profited more reliably than miners. We've seen how land speculation and business development created lasting fortunes while most miners struggled. When we look at the long-term outcomes, the pattern becomes even clearer. The great California fortunes of the late 19th century, the families who dominated San Francisco society, who built mansions on Nob Hill, who controlled railroads and banks and industries, these fortunes were rarely built on mining gold directly. Consider the examples we've touched on. Sam Brannan made his initial fortune selling supplies to miners, then invested in real estate and banking. His wealth came from serving the gold rush, not from mining. Levi Strauss built an empire on durable pants for workers, a product the gold rush created demand for but which had nothing to do with extracting gold from the ground. The Big Four who built the Transcontinental Railroad, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker started as merchants in Sacramento during the gold rush, accumulating capital by selling to miners, then parlaying that capital into railroad building and other ventures. The miners themselves, the men who actually did the work of finding gold, rarely accumulated lasting wealth. A few did, certainly. There are well-documented cases of men who found rich claims, extracted substantial gold, invested wisely, and ended up wealthy. But these were exceptions. Notable because they were rare. The typical miner, if we can speak of such a thing, worked hard for months or years, found enough gold to survive but not to become wealthy, and eventually either left California disappointed or stayed and found some other occupation. Some mining fortunes were made, but they came later, after the placer gold was exhausted, in the era of industrial hard rock mining. The owners of quartz mines and stamp mills, the investors who financed deep shaft mining, the engineers who developed more efficient extraction techniques, these people could accumulate wealth because they controlled capital-intensive operations that individual miners couldn't compete with. The Comstock lode in Nevada, discovered in 1859, created genuine mining fortunes, but even there, the fortunes went primarily to those who controlled the mines and mills, not to the miners who worked in them. This pattern reveals something important about how wealth is actually created and accumulated in a capitalist economy. The romantic story is that individual effort and daring bring rewards, that the person who takes risks deserves the profits. And there's some truth to this. Risk does deserve compensation. But the bigger truth is that wealth flows to those who control resources, infrastructure, and capital, not necessarily to those who do the hardest work. The miner bent over his pan or rocker worked extraordinarily hard, took substantial risks by coming to California, showed remarkable determination and endurance. But the merchant who sold him supplies, the landowner who owned the ground he mined, the banker who held his gold, they were positioned to extract wealth more systematically and reliably. The gold rush established California's economy and provided capital for subsequent development, but the mechanism wasn't straightforward. The gold itself was largely exported, shipped to the East Coast or to Europe to pay for manufactured goods and supplies. California in the 1850s was a consumer of manufactured goods, not a producer. The shovels and pans, the clothing and food, the machinery and tools, most of this was made elsewhere and imported. So the gold flowed out of California to pay for imports, enriching manufacturers and merchants in the East and in Europe as much as it enriched Californians. But the gold also attracted people, and the people created the real economy. The population growth, from perhaps 15,000 non-native inhabitants in 1848 to perhaps 300,000 by 1855, created demand for everything: housing, food, transportation, services of every kind. This demand stimulated local production and entrepreneurship. The farms established to feed the mining population became the foundation for California's agricultural economy. The businesses created to serve miners diversified and grew. The infrastructure built during the rush, roads, ports, towns, served California's development for generations. California's statehood and rapid population growth also had significant political effects nationally. California entered the Union as a free state, not allowing slavery, which upset the careful balance between free and slave states that had been maintained in the Senate. This contributed to the growing sectional tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. California's gold also helped finance the Union cause during that war, providing capital and resources that the Confederacy couldn't match. So the gold rush had consequences that extended far beyond California, shaping national politics and the outcome of the nation's greatest crisis. The mythology of the gold rush perhaps mattered as much as the reality. The stories of striking it rich, of ordinary men becoming wealthy, of California as the land of opportunity. These stories spread around the world and became embedded in American culture. The idea of quote 14 to seek fortune, of leaving behind your old life and reinventing yourself on the frontier, of America as a place where anyone could succeed regardless of background. These ideas were powerfully reinforced by the gold rush, even though the actual gold rush often contradicted them. The reality was that most people didn't strike it rich, that success depended heavily on resources and connections you brought with you, that racial and ethnic minorities faced systematic discrimination, that luck mattered as much as hard work. But the mythology emphasized the success stories, the lucky strikes, the rags to riches tales. And the mythology mattered because it shaped people's decisions and aspirations. Millions of people over the following decades would move west, would seek opportunities in California and other western states, influenced by the gold rush dream, even if the specific opportunity was farming or railroad building or something else entirely. The gold rush established a pattern that would repeat throughout American history. The boom and bust cycle, the rush to the next big thing. The conviction that this time will be different, that fortunes are there for the taking if you just get there early enough. The silver rushes in Nevada and Colorado, the oil booms in Pennsylvania and Texas and California, the land rushes in Oklahoma and elsewhere, the tech boom in Silicon Valley. All of these followed patterns established during the California gold rush. People rush to the new opportunity. Early arrivals sometimes do very well. Infrastructure develops to serve the rushers. Most participants don't get rich, but some accumulate modest success. The boom eventually subsides into something more normal, and the mythology of the boom influences the next generation's decisions. This pattern reveals something about American character and American capitalism, a restless optimism, a willingness to take risks, a faith that the next opportunity will be the one that pays off. These qualities have driven remarkable innovation and development, but they've also led to repeated cycles of speculation and disappointment, to environmental destruction in pursuit of short-term gain, to the exploitation of those with less power by those with more. The gold rush also established California's unique position in the American imagination. California became, and remains, the place you go to reinvent yourself, to escape your past, to pursue dreams that seem impossible elsewhere. This idea has some basis in reality. California's rapid growth and economic diversity have created genuine opportunities, but it's also been oversold, has lured people with unrealistic expectations, has created a gap between promise and reality that can be painful. The environmental legacy of the gold rush continues to shape California. The mercury in the waterways, the hydraulic mining scars, the altered river systems, the introduced species, these are permanent or at least multi-generational changes. Modern California inherited a landscape fundamentally modified by gold rush activity, and current environmental management must account for this legacy. The Yuba River, buried under hydraulic mining debris, required decades of dredging and restoration work that continues today. The mercury contamination requires ongoing monitoring and fish consumption advisories. The water rights established during the gold rush, when miners needed to divert streams, became the basis for California's complex and contentious water law. For California's native peoples, the gold rush remains a trauma whose effects persist. The population decline from perhaps 150,000 to perhaps 30,000 between 1848 and 1870 was catastrophic. The destruction of traditional economies and ways of life, the loss of land, the violence and disease, these created wounds that subsequent generations inherited. The native peoples who survived faced continued discrimination, poverty, and marginalization throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some measure of recovery has occurred. California now has perhaps 150,000 people who identify as Native American, though many are from other tribal groups who moved to California later. But the damage done during the gold rush period was profound and lasting. The Chinese American community in California also traces its origins to the gold rush. Though the community that exists today developed through generations of struggle against discrimination, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited Chinese immigration, was the culmination of anti-Chinese sentiment that began during the gold rush. The act wasn't fully repealed until 1943, and its effect shaped Chinese American communities for generations. But those communities persisted, maintained cultural identity, and eventually became integral parts of California's diverse society. The individuals who participated in the gold rush had wildly varying outcomes, and following a few of their stories illustrates the range of possibilities. James Marshall, who discovered the gold at Sutter's mill and started the whole rush, spent his later years bitter and poor. He felt he deserved compensation for his discovery, but received none. He tried mining without success, tried various business ventures that failed, and eventually lived on a small pension granted by the California legislature in recognition of his discovery. He died in 1885 in poverty, largely forgotten by the state he'd helped create. John Sutter, on whose land the gold was discovered, was ruined by the rush he'd tried to prevent. His land was overrun, his workers deserted him, his cattle were slaughtered, his crops destroyed. He spent decades pursuing legal claims to his property but was generally unsuccessful. He left California in 1865, moved to Pennsylvania, and spent his remaining years lobbying Congress for compensation for his losses. He died in 1880, still pursuing his claims, having lost nearly everything to the very discovery that should have made him fabulously wealthy. Sam Brannan, who'd announced the gold discovery and profited enormously as a merchant, became California's first millionaire. He invested in real estate, in businesses, in agriculture. He founded the town of Calistoga, promoted it as a resort destination. He became involved in politics and civic affairs. But Brannan's later years were less successful. He divorced his wife, who received a large settlement. He made poor investments in Mexico. He drank heavily. He died in 1889 in San Diego. His fortune largely dissipated, though he'd had wealth and influence for decades. Levi Strauss, who arrived after the initial rush but built his business serving miners and workers, created lasting success. His company, making those durable riveted pants, thrived during his lifetime and long after. Strauss became a respected San Francisco business leader, a philanthropist, a pillar of the community. When he died in 1902, he left an estate worth several $1,000,000, and the company he'd founded continued to grow, eventually becoming an international corporation. Strauss's success came from understanding what people needed and providing it reliably, not from the dramatic gamble of mining. For the typical miner, the outcomes were more modest. Many worked in California for a few years, earned enough to survive but not to get wealthy, then either stayed in California and found other work or returned home with little to show for their efforts. Some married, raised families, became farmers or shopkeepers or labourers, lived ordinary lives that weren't remarkable but also weren't failures. They'd had an adventure, had seen California, had tested themselves against difficult circumstances, and had survived. Perhaps that was enough, even if it wasn't the fortune they'd hoped for. The gold rush revealed fundamental truths about speculation and economic booms. The early participants, those who arrived in 1848 or very early 1849 before the huge influx, had the best opportunities. The easily accessible gold was theirs for the taking, and many of them did well. But each successive wave of arrivals found it harder to succeed because the easy opportunities were already taken. By 1850, a new arrival faced much worse odds than someone who'd arrived a year earlier. By 1852, the odds were worse still. This is the nature of booms. Early participants benefit, later participants chase opportunities that have already been exploited. But the stories that spread are always the early success stories, not the later disappointments. So each wave of participants thinks they can succeed like the early arrivals did, not realizing that the fundamental situation has changed. The publicity and the mythology lag behind the reality, always showing the boom at its peak rather than in its decline. This pattern explains why booms always attract too many participants. If perfect information were available, if everyone knew the true odds, fewer people would participate and those who did would make more rational decisions. But information is never perfect. Stories are always more compelling than statistics, and hope is a powerful motivator. So people continue to rush to opportunities even after the opportunities have diminished, driven by stories of success that are true but not representative. The gold rush also demonstrated the power of infrastructure and timing in economic development. San Francisco's success as a city wasn't inevitable. It succeeded partly because of geography, with an excellent harbour, but also because it was positioned as the gateway to the gold fields. Sacramento succeeded for similar reasons. The towns and businesses that positioned themselves correctly in the early days of the rush benefited from lock-in effects. Once trade routes and patterns were established, they tended to persist, giving early movers lasting advantages. This timing advantage applied to individuals as well as places. A merchant who arrived in 1848 or early 1849, before competition was intense, could charge enormous prices and accumulate capital. That capital could then be invested in land, in business expansion, in opportunities that later arrivals couldn't afford. So the early merchants became the established merchants, became the landowners and developers, became the elite. Later merchants faced more competition, lower margins, fewer opportunities for dramatic success. The gold rush was, in many ways, a massive gamble, with tens of thousands of people betting years of their lives and their life savings on the possibility of finding gold. Like any gamble, most participants lost or broke even, and a few won big. But unlike casino gambling, where the odds are known and fixed, the odds in the gold rush varied by timing, location, skill, and luck, in ways that were impossible to calculate accurately. This uncertainty allowed hope to flourish. You could always believe that your claim might be different, that tomorrow might bring the big strike, that your luck was about to turn. The psychological pull of this hope is powerful and explains much about why people persisted in mining even when it wasn't economically rational to continue. The concept of sunk costs, the idea that money and time already spent shouldn't influence current decisions, is logically sound but psychologically difficult. a miner who'd spent 6 months and all his savings getting to California, and another 6 months working a marginal claim, faced a hard choice. Leaving meant admitting that all that time and money was wasted. Staying meant hoping that eventually the investment would pay off. Most chose to stay, keep hoping, keep working, because the psychological cost of admitting failure was too high. This dynamic trapped many miners in California longer than was wise. They couldn't admit defeat, couldn't give up the dream, couldn't accept that they'd bet wrong. So they stayed, working marginal claims, earning just enough to survive, always hoping that the next week or month would be different. Some eventually gave up and went home or found other work. Others stayed in the mining districts for years, even decades, becoming old men, still panning for gold, their lives consumed by the pursuit of a dream that never quite materialized. The gold rush revealed both the best and worst of human nature. There was a remarkable cooperation and mutual aid, miners helping each other, communities forming spontaneously, strangers sharing what they had. There was also terrible violence, discrimination, exploitation, and greed. People are capable of both generosity and cruelty, often simultaneously. And the gold rush provided circumstances where both were displayed openly. The rush also revealed the power of dreams and stories in shaping human behavior. The factual reality of the gold rush. Hard work, uncertain rewards, most people not getting rich, should have discouraged participation. But the stories, the lucky strikes, the nuggets the size of eggs, the fortunes made overnight, were so compelling that they overwhelmed the reality. People made decisions based on the stories they wanted to believe, rather than the facts that were available. This is a very human tendency, not limited to the gold rush, but the rush demonstrated it clearly. Looking back from our perspective today, more than 170 years later, the California gold rush seems both remarkably distant and strangely familiar. The specific circumstances were unique to their time. The technology, the social structures, the legal framework, all of these were products of the mid-19th century. But the underlying patterns, the boom and bust cycle, the gap between promise and reality, the early movers benefiting more than later arrivals, the infrastructure builders profiting more reliably than the producers, the environmental and human costs being paid by those with least power, these patterns remain recognizable because they've repeated in different forms throughout American history and continue to this day. The gold rush built California. There's no question about that. The population it attracted, the capital it generated, the infrastructure it created, these became the foundation for everything that followed. California today, as the most populous state and one of the world's largest economies, traces its origins directly to those frenzied years between 1848 and the middle 1850s. Without the gold rush, California's development would have been slower, different, perhaps fundamentally altered. But the rush also destroyed native peoples and ecosystems, destroyed dreams and lives, created patterns of inequality and exploitation that persisted for generations. Any honest accounting of the gold rush must include both what was built and what was destroyed, must acknowledge both the opportunity it created and the costs that were paid, must recognize that the same events that enriched some people devastated others. The ultimate legacy of the California gold rush is complex and contradictory, which is perhaps fitting for an event that was itself complex and contradictory. It was simultaneously a triumph of human ambition and determination and a catastrophe of greed and violence. It created opportunities and destroyed them. It brought people together from around the world and divided them through prejudice and conflict. It built a state and ruined a landscape. It enriched a few, gave many others modest success, and left most with little but stories. And the stories, perhaps, are what endure most powerfully. The image of the 49er with his pain and his hope, searching the streams for gold. This image became iconic, became part of how Americans understand themselves and their history. the idea of California as the place where dreams can come true, where fortunes can be made, where anyone can reinvent themselves. This idea, born in the gold rush, persists despite all evidence of its limitations. The myth and the reality coexist, shaping how we understand the past and how we imagine the future, reminding us that human beings are creatures of hope and story, as much as we are creatures of reason and fact. And so we've travelled together through the California gold rush, from that quiet January morning at Sutter's Mill, through the frenzied years of hope and hardship, through the transformation of a landscape and a people, to the settling that came after the storm passed. We've walked alongside those who made the journey, the dreamers and the desperate, the lucky and the lost, and we've seen what their dreams cost and what they built. The gold rush reminds us that human beings are always searching, always hoping for transformation, always willing to risk everything for the possibility of something better. That search drives us to remarkable achievements and terrible mistakes, often simultaneously. The 49ers weren't so different from us. They wanted security, opportunity, escape, reinvention, the same things we want. They just pursued those desires with the tools and understanding of their time. If you're still awake, let yourself drift now. Let the story settle like sediment in a pan, the important things remaining while everything else washes away. The search for gold is finished. The miners have gone home or found new lives. California sleeps under the same stars that watched over the diggings. Breathe slowly. Feel the weight of your own body, solid and present. You are here, now, safe and still. The past is past. The stories are told. Let them carry you gently into sleep, into dreams, into rest. Good night.